Chapter 1. Before Miami was Miami. Long before the skyline shimmered over Biscayne Bay, before the neon glow of South Beach and the hum of traffic along I-95, the land we call Miami belonged to a people who had no word for city. They lived by tides, stars, and the sound of wind moving through mangrove forests. They hunted, gathered, fished, and worshipped in a world that felt eternal. This land was the domain of the Tequesta, one of the oldest native peoples of southeastern Florida. Guardians of a subtropical world that thrived for thousands of years before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. If you could stand at the mouth of the Miami River 3,000 years ago, you would see none of the landmarks that define the modern city. No skyscrapers, no bridges, no cruise ships in the distance. Instead, you'd be surrounded by dense hammocks of mahogany and gumbo limbo trees. The river would flow slowly from the Everglades toward the sparkling water of Biscayne Bay, a lifeline that sustained an entire civilization. Canoes carved from cypress trunks would glide soundlessly across the water, guided by men whose skin bore the sun and salt of a life lived outdoors. Smoke from cooking fires would drift over the riverbank, carrying the scent of roasted fish. On the horizon, the Atlantic would glow in shades of blue so deep it almost looked unreal. This was the Tequesta world, a world of cycles, rituals, spirits, and survival. They were not the largest tribe in Florida. That honor belonged to the powerful Calusa on the Gulf Coast. But the Tequesta were among the most resilient. They learned to thrive in an environment that few outsiders, not even the earliest Spanish explorers, could understand or withstand. Their society flourished not through agriculture, but through intimate knowledge of the subtropical ecosystems around them. They lived on fish, shellfish, turtles, manatees, deer, wild fruits, and roots. They knew which plants healed and which poisoned. They mastered the tides and understood the behavior of every animal that crossed their path. The Tequesta were a river people. The heart of their world sat where the Miami River meets Biscayne Bay, a place modern Floridians know as Brickell Point, a place that today is surrounded by steel towers, restaurants, and financial centers. But 3 millennia ago, this point was sacred ground, carefully shaped by human hands into a circular arrangement of limestone basins and carvings. This is the site that archaeologists now call the Miami Circle, one of the most mysterious and important prehistoric archaeological discoveries in the United States. It is a perfect circle, 13 meters in diameter, cut directly into the bedrock. Some cavities are thought to have held posts for structures. Others may have served ceremonial purposes. And some, perhaps, were never meant to be understood by anyone outside Tequesta spiritual life. The Miami Circle reminds us of a truth often forgotten. Miami did not begin in 1896 with the arrival of the railroad. Its roots lie thousands of years deeper. The circle is a testament to a people who carved their beliefs directly into the land, leaving behind traces of their ceremonies, institutions, and worldview long after their names were lost. They built wooden structures above the limestone, possibly temples or council houses, places where leaders gathered to decide the fate of the community, where elders recited the stories of creation, and where rituals honored ancestors whose bones rested in nearby mounds. The Tequesta lived in small villages scattered along the river and the bay. Their houses were circular, made of wood and thatch, elevated slightly to avoid the ever-present threat of flooding. Life revolved around extended families, each group guided by a leader whose authority rested not on force, but on wisdom, experience, and success in providing for the community. spiritual life was equally central. The Tequesta believed in a world filled with spirits, some benevolent, some dangerous. The afterlife was a realm where warriors and hunters traveled westward, toward the land of the setting sun. Rituals involving bones, especially skulls, played a deep role in their beliefs. Modern ears may find it unsettling, but for the Tequesta, these rituals were sacred acts of remembrance, honoring the dead and binding the living together. Their world was abundant but demanding. Summers were oppressively hot, with humidity thick enough to feel on the skin like a weight. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, hurricanes tore through the region with devastating force. The Everglades, stretching endlessly to the west, were both a provider and a threat. Here, the Tequesta fished, hunted, and navigated through sawgrass and marshes that could swallow a careless traveler. Yet they did not fear the glades. They mastered them. They read the water levels, tracked the movements of birds to find schools of fish, and built canoes that could slip through the narrowest channels. In this environment, they developed an unparalleled knowledge of the sea. Biscayne Bay was their pantry, their marketplace, their crossroads. They caught sharks, rays, mullet, snapper, and manatee. They collected vast amounts of oysters and clams, creating mounds of discarded shells that today rise above the landscape like ancient monuments. These shell middens, some dozens of feet high, were not just garbage piles. They marked settlements, ceremonial sites, and sometimes burial grounds. They were geological timelines of human existence, layer upon layer of shells, bones, tools, and charcoal, quietly holding the memory of centuries. Archaeologists have found tools made of bone, shell, and stone. Spear points carved from deer bone, hammers fashioned from conch shells, and ceremonial items etched with intricate designs. The Tequesta left no written language, but their artistry speaks across millennia. Patterns carved into shell reveal a visual culture that valued symmetry, symbolism, and beauty. Even everyday tools were shaped with care. In every object, you can feel the hands of a people who understood the land's rhythm and molded their lives to match it. Their relationships with neighboring tribes shaped their identity. To the west lived the fierce Calusa, whose influence spread across the southern peninsula. The Tequesta were often overshadowed by them but maintained their autonomy through diplomacy and occasional alliances. Trade routes connected them to tribes in the north and across the Caribbean. Items made of exotic materials, shark teeth, stingray spines, even copper, have been found in Tequesta sites, proving that goods traveled great distances through indigenous networks long before Europeans arrived. Miami, even then, was a crossroads between worlds. But the circle, perhaps more than any artifact, captures the essence of who the Tequesta were. It lies at the center of their settlement, directly facing the river. Scholars have debated its purpose. Some believe it was the foundation of a chief's house or a ceremonial building. Others think it was an astronomical marker. And some argue that it marked a place where the Tequesta communicated with the spiritual world. Whatever the purpose, the circle reveals that this land held meaning for them far greater than mere survival. It was a place chosen intentionally, shaped deliberately, and used for generations. Imagine a ceremony there. Night has fallen. The air is warm and thick, carrying the scent of mangroves and salt. Torches flicker around the circle. Elders chant stories passed down through centuries. The chief stands at the center, the limestone beneath him glowing faintly in the firelight. Children watch in silence, absorbing the rituals that will one day guide their own lives. Above them, Stars shimmer in the dark sky, the same stars that would guide Polynesians across oceans and, many generations later, guide Spanish ships toward these shores. In that moment, the circle is the heart of a world that feels timeless. The Tequesta population likely never exceeded several thousand, spread across dozens of small settlements from the Keys to the northern Everglades. This may seem small, but it allowed them to live sustainably in a fragile environment. They understood that the land could provide only so much. Their survival depended on balance, taking only what the sea and river offered, never exhausting their resources. They lived with an ecological wisdom that modern Miami, with its concrete, steel, and relentless growth, often struggles to remember. Their challenges were real. Hurricanes could wipe out entire fishing grounds. Rising or falling water levels could destroy access to food. Predatory animals, from panthers to alligators, were constant threats. Disease could spread quickly in close quarters. Yet the Tequesta endured for centuries, adjusting to every change the land imposed. Their culture evolved slowly, shaped by experience rather than conquest or expansion. Their world was stable, rooted, patient. And then one day, everything began to change. Some of the first outsiders who encountered them were Spanish explorers in the early 1500s. The Tequesta watched as unfamiliar ships approached the coastline, wooden giants with billowing sails. To the Spanish, the Tequesta appeared cautious, elusive, and fiercely independent. To the Tequesta, the Spanish must have seemed like beings from another world. Their metal weapons, their diseases, their horses, none of these belonged to the world the Tequesta knew. But in this first chapter of Miami's history, the Spanish have not yet arrived. That moment, and the chaos it brings, belongs to a later chapter. For now, the Tequesta world remains whole, untouched, thriving. Their society is strong. Their beliefs are intact. Their connection to the land is absolute. Thousands of years from now, their descendants will be gone, their language lost, their rituals forgotten. But traces of their existence, the circle, the shell mounds, the tools buried beneath skyscrapers, will whisper to archaeologists and historians alike. We were here. This chapter ends on the cusp of transformation. The Tequesta world stands at the shoreline of history, unaware that forces from across the ocean are already sailing toward them. Forces that will reshape their destiny forever. Forces that will dismantle the life they have known for centuries. The land they cared for will become a battleground between empires, a refuge for fugitives, a frontier for settlers, and eventually a metropolis unlike any other. But before all of that, before the wars, before the railroad, before the hurricanes and the neon, before Miami had a name, this was the world of the Tequesta, a world carved into limestone, whispered through the mangroves, and carried on the tides of Biscayne Bay. A world that endures in traces and memories, waiting for us to uncover its story. And it is from this ancient foundation that the next chapter begins, as ships from distant kingdoms move closer to the Florida coast, and the Tequesta, standing at the edge of the Atlantic, prepare to meet a world they could never have imagined. Chapter 2. Spain arrives. When the first Spanish sails appeared along the Florida coast, the Tequesta stood at the edge of a world they had never imagined. The Atlantic, which for thousands of years had been a boundary marking the known limits of existence, suddenly became a doorway, one through which danger, opportunity, and irreversible change would enter. It began quietly, with rumors among coastal villagers who saw strange shapes on the horizon. Wooden mountains, cloud-like fabrics catching the wind, and men whose skin was pale, armor glinting in the sun. This was the beginning of Miami's transformation, though no one living at the time could have sensed the magnitude of the shift. The Spanish did not arrive as settlers at first. They came as explorers, restless, ambitious, convinced they stood on the threshold of unimaginable wealth. Juan Ponce de Leon had landed along the Florida coast in 1513, driven by stories of riches and perhaps even the mythical fountain of youth. He never found what he sought, but his arrival marked the first point of contact between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of South Florida. Reports from his expedition described the coastal tribes as formidable, independent, and wary. The Tequesta were among them, proud, cautious, and unaligned with any external power. In the years that followed, more Spanish expeditions brushed against the edges of Tequesta territory. Ships traveled through the Florida Straits, hugging the coastline on journeys between Spain and the thriving colonial capital of Havana. To the Spanish crown, Florida was not a priority. It was a navigational hazard, a dangerous coastline dotted with reefs, storms, and shipwrecks. But to the Tequesta, the sudden presence of foreign ships was a sign that the world was shifting. Canoes ventured closer to observe, though never too close. Stories spread among villages of men who emerged from the sea speaking unknown tongues. The Tequesta had no frame of reference for Europe or the Old World. These encounters must have felt like glimpses of a realm beyond the spirit world itself. The Spanish soon realized that the waters around modern-day Miami were strategically important. The Gulf Stream ran just offshore, carrying Spanish treasure fleets northward along the Florida coast before they crossed the Atlantic. But the same current that sped their passage also made the region perilous. Storms could push galleons onto reefs. Shipwreck survivors, if they reached shore, encountered lands ruled by tribes who had no reason to welcome strangers. Many Spaniards who washed up near the Miami River never returned home. It was these dangers, combined with imperial ambition, that eventually pushed Spain to try establishing a foothold among the Tequesta. In 1566, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, the same governor who founded St. Augustine, sailed south to the mouth of the Miami River. A year earlier, he had eradicated the French settlement at Fort Caroline. Now he sought to bring the people of South Florida under the Spanish sphere. Menéndez was a man of stern Catholic faith and unshakable purpose. He viewed the indigenous peoples not simply as subjects to be claimed, but as souls to be converted. He brought Jesuit missionaries with him, men of conviction who believed that the salvation of native peoples depended on their intervention. When Menéndez arrived at the Miami River, he found a Tequesta world weakened by forces the tribe barely understood. Disease had already slipped silently among them. The first viruses likely arrived from Spanish contact elsewhere in Florida. From brief encounters, from objects traded, or from the movement of people who had interacted with Europeans. Illnesses such as smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly through communities that had no immunity. The Tequesta lacked not only defense against these diseases, but also knowledge of how they spread. Traditional healers would have been overwhelmed, their remedies ineffective against invisible killers they had never known. Yet the Tequesta remained proud. When Menéndez came ashore, Tequesta leaders approached cautiously. They were curious, wary, and weakened, but not submissive. Menéndez attempted diplomacy, offering gifts and promises of alliance. The chiefs agreed to limited cooperation, understanding that resisting outright could provoke violence, yet still refusing Spanish authority. In return, they asked for protection against the rival Calusa and the promise of a resident missionary to teach their people about the Spanish God. But there was a deeper political calculation. Aligning with the Spanish might help the Tequesta maintain autonomy in an increasingly unstable world. The Spanish established a small mission near the river. It was not much, just a few wooden structures, a crude chapel, a handful of priests, and a detachment of soldiers. The missionaries tried to teach Spanish prayers, introduce European customs, and encourage the Tequesta to adopt agriculture. But they underestimated the resilience of indigenous culture. The Tequesta did not give up their beliefs, their rituals, or their reverence for ancestral spirits. They attended some lessons, listened politely, and sometimes assisted the priests. But their hearts remained tied to the circle, the river, and their ancient traditions. As months passed, the missionaries found themselves struggling. Supplies from Havana were inconsistent. Food was scarce. The climate was harsh. Mosquitoes carried fevers that ravaged both Europeans and natives. The priests wrote letters complaining of isolation, danger, and the difficulty of converting a people deeply rooted in their own spiritual world. One described the Tequesta as good of heart but unmoved, a phrase that reveals both admiration and frustration. The Tequesta, meanwhile, continued to face the slow devastation of disease. Entire families were wiped out. Elders who held the knowledge of generations died quickly, leaving cultural gaps that would never fully heal. Population numbers plummeted. The tribe that had thrived for millennia along the river and the bay found its strength eroding in ways it could not comprehend. The Spanish presence did not cause the collapse alone, but it accelerated the decline through the introduction of pathogens and the disruption of traditional lifeways. By 1570, the mission was failing. The priests struggled even to keep themselves alive. The Tequesta, who had expected assistance and protection, received little of either. Spanish priorities lay elsewhere, primarily in Havana, where a flourishing colonial society had taken root. Compared to Havana's wealth, stability, and influence, Miami was little more than a remote outpost, swampy, isolated, and difficult to sustain. The Spanish crown saw no profit in building a colony here. It saw only cost and danger. And so quietly, the mission dissolved. The priests departed, the soldiers left. The settlement decayed, reclaimed by the tropical environment. By the early 1570s, Spain's experiment in Miami was effectively abandoned. The Tequesta were once again alone on their land, though now forever changed. The spiritual balance of their world had been disrupted. Their numbers were reduced, their sense of security shaken. The circle still stood, the river still flowed, but the society that had once flourished was beginning to fragment. Despite this, the Spanish were not gone from the region. They continued to sail past the coastline, stopping occasionally for water or wood. They sometimes traded with the Tequesta, sometimes fought with them, sometimes ignored them altogether. Over time, relations grew strained. The Tequesta resented broken promises. They blamed the Spanish for the diseases that continued to spread. Spanish captains, for their part, viewed the Tequesta as unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Skirmishes occurred. Misunderstandings escalated into violence. The Spanish attempted additional missions in later decades, but none took root. The region was simply too challenging. The coastline was treacherous. The Everglades provided no clear land routes for expansion. Mosquitoes carried diseases that devastated European settlements. Supplies from Havana were unpredictable. And the Tequesta, though weakened, maintained an independence that frustrated Spanish ambitions. They would not be conquered easily. Their allegiance could not be purchased or forced. As the 17th century approached, the Tequesta found themselves caught between survival and decline. Their population continued to shrink. They relied increasingly on Spanish support, even as they distrusted the foreign power. They requested priests again, not because they sought conversion, but because missionaries brought food, tools, and sometimes medical assistance. The Spanish occasionally responded, but their attention drifted constantly back to Havana, where fortunes were rising, trade was booming, and political influence was thick in the air. Havana became the true center of power in the region. In the vast Spanish colonial network, Havana was the hub through which wealth flowed. Gold and silver from Mexico and Peru, tobacco from plantations, goods from Europe. The city flourished into a cosmopolitan capital with fortresses, ships, markets, and government institutions. Compared to Havana's magnificence, the land that would one day become Miami was an afterthought, useful only as a navigational point, a watering stop, or a place to retrieve shipwrecked sailors. Yet the very forces that made Havana strong ultimately overshadowed the Tequesta. As Spanish power consolidated on the island, Florida became peripheral. The Tequesta received fewer resources. Their territory was left unguarded. When the Calusa or other tribes ventured eastward, the Tequesta had little support. When new waves of disease swept through the peninsula, there were no supplies or medicine sent from Havana. The Spanish crown cared about Florida's coastline only when it threatened to impact the treasure fleets. The people who lived there were secondary. Still, the Tequesta endured. They adapted, they moved their villages, they formed alliances. But each passing decade brought more losses. Oral traditions faded as elders died. Families splintered, hunting grounds shrank. The Miami Circle, once filled with life and ritual, became quieter. The Tequesta world, which had lasted thousands of years, was fading into memory. If you walk through modern Brickell today, past luxury condos, glass towers, valet lines, and the constant hum of urban life, it is almost impossible to imagine the fragile balance of that time. But beneath the foundations of these buildings, beneath the streets, beneath the concrete and steel, the traces of the Tequesta still lie silently in the earth. Their tools, their shells, their carvings, their fire pits, all buried beneath a city that grew from a world the Spanish never fully understood. By the early 1700s, the Tequesta were no longer a major force. The once thriving population had been reduced to a fraction of its size. Some joined the Spanish on missions in the Keys or on the fringes of Cuba. Some merged with other displaced indigenous groups. Some vanished without record, their names and stories lost forever. And yet, despite their decline, the region they once dominated remained unclaimed in any real sense. Spain possessed Florida on paper, but not in practice. The Miami River area continued to be a frontier backwater, untamed, ungoverned, and largely ignored. This chapter in Miami's story ends with a strange paradox. Spain arrived with grand visions of empire, conversion, and control, yet left the region fundamentally unchanged. Their missions failed. Their influence was fleeting. They introduced disease, disruption, and diplomacy, but not development. Miami did not become a Spanish city. It did not become a colony. It simply remained itself, a place between worlds, neither fully indigenous nor fully European, a landscape waiting for its next chapter. And that next chapter would arrive not through peaceful missions, but through conflict, migration, and one of the most brutal periods in Florida's history. As the Tequesta faded, new forces rose in the south, the Seminoles, and the land around the Miami River would once again become a battleground. Chapter 3: Britain, the Bahamas, and a turbulent 18th century. When the Tequesta world faded and Spanish missionaries abandoned their attempts to civilize the unforgiving South, the land around the Miami River slipped into a long, uneasy silence. Spain still claimed Florida, at least on paper, but its presence grew thinner with every year. The real power lay across the water. Havana glowed like a beacon of empire, while South Florida remained an ungoverned edge, a forgotten fringe of the Caribbean. And so the land waited, drifting between decline and possibility, until a new storm approached from across the Atlantic: the British Empire. The transition was not dramatic. There were no great battles on the Miami River, no armies marching through mangroves. Instead, it happened through diplomacy and treaties, quiet signatures on parchment far from the Florida coast. In 1763, the 7 Years' War ended. Europe's borders shifted, colonies changed hands, and Spain, defeated and exhausted, ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for Havana, which the British had seized during the conflict. Havana mattered. Florida did not. And so, without firing a shot in South Florida, the British inherited an enormous wilderness that they barely understood. At the moment the Union Jack was raised in St. Augustine, the territory around the Miami River was nearly empty of permanent communities. The Tequesta had been reduced to a handful of survivors scattered between the Keys and Cuba. Spanish missions were gone. The land was wild, thick forests, tidal creeks, and a coastline littered with wrecks. To the British, this was both a problem and an opportunity. Florida became divided into East and West Florida, each with its own governor. Policies were introduced, settlements planned, colonies envisioned. But while Pensacola and St. Augustine saw new activity, the far southern tip of the peninsula remained a mystery on the map, something that was owned but not controlled. The people who came first were not farmers or garrison soldiers, but wreckers, Bahamian men in fast boats who had long made their living rescuing cargo from ships smashed on the reefs. The British Crown encouraged them, granting them legal status and incentives. Bahamians were experienced in these waters. They understood the coral, the tides, the storms. They came not to settle, but to salvage. Timber, rum, cloth, metal, whatever the sea offered. Their presence grew quickly. Small camps appeared on Key Biscayne, Elliott Key, and the islands of Biscayne Bay. Fires glowed at night. Laughter carried over the water. Their schooners moved like shadows, swift and stealthy. These wreckers were not merely rescuers. Some were opportunists. Some were smugglers. And some, rumors whispered, were little different from pirates. They knew how to find ships in distress, and some knew how to cause distress. Lights placed intentionally on shore could mislead a passing vessel into the rocks. When the waves did the rest, wreckers arrived with practiced calm and empty boats. Whether every incident was sabotage or simply well-timed coincidence depended on who told the story. Yet these Bahamian men, despite their questionable reputation, became the first significant foreign presence around modern-day Miami in more than a century. They brought tools, salted fish, rum, and a sense of Caribbean culture that would later define the region. Their small huts dotted the bay, although few stayed long. They came seasonally, following storms, following opportunity, and left as quickly as they arrived. The British administration wanted more. They envisioned plantations, trade, and society. But the land did not cooperate. The soil was too thin, the heat too intense, the mosquitoes too relentless. Efforts to establish permanent settlements south of the New River faltered. The Everglades, still unmapped and feared, pushed back against every attempt to tame it. And so British Florida developed unevenly, well populated in the north, sparsely inhabited in the center, and nearly untouched in the south. Meanwhile, new people arrived at the fringes. Traders, outlaws, and fugitives who found the remote coast perfect for disappearing. Runaway slaves fled plantations in Georgia and the Carolinas, using knowledge of waterways and forests to slip southward. Some found refuge among remaining indigenous groups or among Bahamian wreckers. Others continued deeper into the wilderness, merging into communities that would later be called Black Seminoles. These were towns of free black families aligned with Seminole tribes, tied together not by ancestry, but by shared opposition to colonial power. They lived in palm thatch houses near the glades, hunted deer, fished the rivers, and built networks of protection against slave catchers who dared not follow them too far into the swamps. At the same time, the Seminoles themselves began to enter the region. They were not originally a Florida tribe. They descended from Creeks and other displaced groups from Georgia and Alabama, who migrated into Spanish and later British Florida in the 1700s. The name Seminole comes from a Spanish word meaning runaway, a term that captured their identity. Independent, defiant, unwilling to be controlled. They moved south slowly, establishing new villages in the Central Peninsula, hunting grounds expanding each year. By the late 18th century, they were reaching into the lands once held by the Tequesta. This movement marked a profound transition in Miami's history. The Miami River area, once dominated by Tequesta culture, now became part of the Seminole sphere, not through conquest, but through the vacuum left by disease and depopulation. The British, for their part, made no attempt to claim the region by force. They lacked the manpower and the incentive. The Seminoles were skilled warriors, intimately familiar with the terrain and deeply connected to their autonomy. The British understood that attempting to subdue them would be costly, so they chose the path of diplomacy and trade. Muskets, cloth, beads, and metal tools flowed into Seminole hands. Deerskins flowed back to the British. The Miami region became a corridor of exchange rather than settlement. But even as new networks formed, the land remained dangerous. Hurricanes scoured the coastline. Reefs swallowed ships whole. Fever swept through camps, killing indiscriminately. The region acquired a reputation, beautiful, bountiful, but deadly. Only those accustomed to hardships stayed. And so South Florida became a haven of misfits. Runaways fleeing the law, deserters from the British Army, former pirates hiding from patrol ships, and traders who operated at the edges of legality. This was a frontier in the truest sense, a place without rules, without order, without permanence. The British governors in St. Augustine wrote frequently about the southern extremity, always with vague frustration. They wanted to tax the wreckers, but could not locate them. They wanted to negotiate with the Seminoles, but had no outpost near their territory. They wanted to extend British authority, but had no incentive to invest in a region with no plantations, no ports, and no roads. Miami was not yet a name, not yet a vision, just a tangle of rivers, mangroves, and possibilities. The American Revolution complicated everything further. When war broke out in 1775, East Florida remained loyal to the British Crown, one of the few regions in North America that did. Loyalist families fled from Georgia and the Carolinas seeking protection under British rule. Some ended up in St. Augustine, others in small settlements along the St. Johns River. But a handful drifted farther south, hoping the remote wilderness might shield them from the chaos of war. These families brought livestock, seeds, and dreams of building a new life. Most found the environment unbearable. Their attempts at farming failed. Hurricanes destroyed their homes. Supplies from the north were cut off by war. Many retreated back to the more populous regions. Some perished. The few who remained blended into the small, shifting population of wreckers and traders along the coast. For Britain, Florida proved far more trouble than it was worth. The war strained resources. The empire was stretched thin. And so, when the Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution in 1783, Britain returned Florida to Spain. The decision was pragmatic. Spain had supported the Americans indirectly, and Florida served as diplomatic compensation. But Britain's brief rule had left an imprint. New trade networks, new cultural influences, and new groups of people scattered across the southern end of the peninsula. When Spain regained control, they inherited a territory more diverse and unruly than the one they had lost 2 decades earlier. The Seminoles were stronger, more numerous, and politically independent. The black Seminole communities were thriving. The Bahamian wreckers remained active along the coast. And the Miami River area had become a crossroads of cultures: African, indigenous, Bahamian, British, Spanish, all existing in a patchwork that defied neat colonial categories. But Spain's return did not bring order. If anything, the situation grew even more unstable. Spain's empire was weakening. Havana dominated their attention. South Florida remained a fringe zone, useful only when shipwrecks occurred or when Seminole alliances mattered. Spanish officials tried re-establishing missions and garrisons, but the region resisted them as stubbornly as ever. No European power could tame the heat, the hurricanes, or the Everglades. The Miami region stayed wild, untamed, and essentially ungoverned. By the late 1700s, the Miami River area had become one of the least controlled regions in North America. It was a refuge for people who lived outside the reach of colonial power. Seminole leaders hunted deer along the riverbanks. Bahamian boats moved through the bay under moonlight. Cattle stolen from northern ranches were driven south into the wilderness. Slaves fleeing plantations found new lives far from their former masters. Smugglers traded goods with passing ships. Every so often, a Spanish patrol might appear, attempting to assert authority. But the moment they left, the wilderness reclaimed control. If someone from today could be transported back to that world, they would see no sign that it would ever become a great city. Nothing about it suggested future highways or skyscrapers or crowds of millions. It was a raw landscape filled with buzzing insects, thick forests, and shallow waters stretching endlessly toward the horizon. But it was alive in ways modern Miami can barely comprehend. A land defined by freedom and danger, secrecy and survival. This chapter closes at a moment of rising tension. Britain came and went. Spain returned, but never truly ruled. The Tequesta were gone. The Seminoles were rising. And the land that would become Miami was entering a new era, one marked not by treaties, but by war. Hostilities between the United States and the Seminoles would soon erupt in a series of brutal conflicts that would reshape the entire peninsula. And so, as the 18th century ended and the dawn of the 19th approached, Miami remained what it had been for centuries, a place on the edge, untamed, unclaimed, full of possibility, and waiting for its next great upheaval. Chapter 4. The Seminoles and the Swamps. As the 18th century closed and the 19th emerged, the land around the Miami River entered one of the darkest and most transformative periods in its history. The region had drifted for decades, claimed by Spain, touched briefly by Britain, shaped by Bahamians and traders, but controlled by no one. Now, a new force rose to claim it, the United States. And that rising power was determined to assert control over all of Florida. Even the southern wilderness the Spanish had never managed to tame. What followed would turn the swamps, hammocks, and riverbanks around future Miami into a battleground where nations, cultures, and identities collided. When the United States acquired Florida from Spain in 1821, the region was barely more than a rumor to American officials. Maps showed vast blank spaces where the Everglades stretched. The Miami River area appeared only as a thin blue line flowing into Biscayne Bay. No towns existed, no garrisons, no forts, no roads. But the Americans brought with them a new ambition: order. And to achieve it, they needed to deal with the people who now dominated the peninsula, the Seminoles. The Seminole nation had grown in strength throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s. They were not a single tribe, but a confederation of indigenous groups who had migrated south, adopting new identities shaped by the land. They were hunters, traders, and fierce defenders of autonomy. But what made them particularly threatening to American interests was their alliance with runaway African communities. Black Seminoles, freed or escaped slaves who found refuge among the tribe, became integral parts of Seminole society. They married into families, built villages, and fought alongside Seminole warriors. Their existence infuriated Southern slaveholders, who saw Florida as a sanctuary where their enslaved workers could disappear forever. To the United States, the Seminoles represented both a political and racial threat. What began in the North as territorial disputes slowly built toward war. American settlers pushed southward. Tensions rose over land treaties, often manipulated or forged by U.S. agents. The Seminoles resisted, and in 1817, long before Florida became an American territory, the First Seminole War erupted, sparked partly by attempts to capture runaway slaves and punish the tribe for harboring them. Andrew Jackson himself led forces into Florida, burning towns, destroying farms, and executing leaders. It was a brutal preview of what would come. And though the war ended quickly, it left deep scars. By the 1830s, the U.S. government turned its full attention to removing the Seminoles entirely. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 sought to push all native tribes west of the Mississippi River. The Seminoles were expected to leave their homes, their hunting grounds, their ancestors' graves, and move to Arkansas Territory. But the Seminoles refused. Chiefs like McCanopy, Jumper, and the legendary Osceola vowed to stay. They knew the swamps, the hammocks, the hidden trails. They knew the Everglades, an immense fortress of sawgrass, mud, and water that no conventional army could penetrate. They had the land on their side. The Second Seminole War began in 1835, and no part of Florida remained untouched. It became one of the longest and costliest Indian wars in U.S. history. and the region around the Miami River, remote, unpredictable, and largely unknown, became one of its fiercest arenas. It started with small detachments of U.S. soldiers scouting the area, searching for Seminole villages or pathways into the Everglades. They found little but mosquitoes, dense forests, and endless expanses of water. The Seminoles lived across a vast, shifting landscape. Their villages could appear or disappear in days. Warriors moved silently through cypress domes, using canoes hidden in tree cover. To the American military, the land was a nightmare. To the Seminoles, it was home. In 1836, to secure a foothold in the region, U.S. forces established a military post along the Miami River, built on the remains of an old plantation from Spanish times. They named it Fort Dallas. On the site where skyscrapers eventually would rise, soldiers hammered together wooden barracks, storage sheds, and a small stone structure that still stands today. At night, they listened to the sounds of the wilderness, unfamiliar cries of animals, rustling leaves, water moving through unseen channels. Every sound could mean danger. Fort Dallas became both a refugee and a prison. Soldiers stationed there were isolated, surrounded by enemies they could not see. Supply lines from Key West or the north were unpredictable. Storms destroyed small boats. Fever spread quickly. Letters from officers described the misery, heat so intense it warped wood. Insects so relentless that sleep became impossible. And the constant fear that the next Seminole attack would strike before dawn. And those attacks did come. Seminole warriors struck with precision, appearing suddenly out of the trees before vanishing into the wetlands. They attacked supply trains, ambushed scouting parties, burned fields, and cut communication lines. Black Seminoles joined them, fighting not only for land, but for freedom. Freedom from slavery, from capture, from being forced westward into unfamiliar territory. Their skill in navigating the landscape made them invaluable. They helped guide Seminole warriors through narrow creeks, deep marshes, and hidden trails that U.S. soldiers never fully mapped. To counter this guerrilla warfare, American commanders adopted a strategy of devastation. If they could not defeat the Seminoles in battle, they would destroy their ability to survive. So began the Scorched Earth Campaign. Soldiers burned villages, torched crops, seized livestock, and cut down fruit groves. They set fire to miles of the Everglades perimeter, forcing families deeper into the wilderness. The goal was not just victory, it was displacement. In South Florida, these tactics turned entire landscapes into charred ruins. Smoke rose from hammocks that had stood for generations. Canoes were smashed. Chickees, native dwellings, were pulled down or burned. The Miami River area, already sparsely populated, now became a place of ruins and ash. Fort Dallas served as a staging point for these campaigns, and troops marched from its gates into the unknown, sometimes never returning. One of the most haunting aspects of the war was the relentless attempt by the U.S. Army to capture black Seminoles. Slave hunters accompanied military units, hoping to reclaim what they saw as property. For them, the war was not only about land, but about race. They believed that allowing free black communities to thrive in Florida threatened the entire social order of the South. Some of the most desperate and courageous escapes in American history occurred in these swamps, families fleeing through mud and water, carrying children, pursued by soldiers and bloodhounds. Many found sanctuary deep in the Everglades, forming hidden communities that survived for decades. But despite their resilience, the Seminoles suffered terrible losses. Disease spread among them just as it had among the Tequesta generations earlier. The constant movement, the lack of stable villages, and shortages of food weakened entire bands. Some chiefs were captured under false flags of truce. Others died from battle wounds or illness. Slowly, the Seminole world was pushed southward, closer to the tangled heart of the Everglades. By 1838, the U.S. Army believed it had gained the upper hand. Troops penetrated deeper into the swamps than ever before. Using soldiers from Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and even dragoons on horses, they tried, often unsuccessfully, to maneuver through marshland. Steam-powered shallow draft boats were introduced to navigate the Everglades' watery labyrinth. But even with new tactics, American forces found themselves lost, disoriented, and exhausted. Officers wrote that the Everglades were a hideous region of darkness and dread. Soldiers disappeared in the night, lost to mud, wildlife, drowning, or ambush. Fort Dallas continued to grow as a central base. At one point, it held hundreds of soldiers, infantry, Marines, naval officers sent from Key West, and support units. Nearby, military engineers constructed a road across the wilderness to connect posts. That road would later influence the path of the modern Miami Trail. But even with this infrastructure, Miami remained a peripheral battlefield, a staging ground for campaigns that pushed farther west, deeper into Seminole territory. The war dragged on for years. Costs ballooned. Public support waned. Some officers began to question whether removing the Seminoles was even possible. The Everglades were simply too vast, too unpredictable, too alive. And the Seminoles had no intention of surrendering their homeland. By 1842, after 7 exhausting years, the U.S. government declared the Second Seminole War over. Not because they had defeated the Seminoles, but because they were tired of fighting. A few hundred Seminoles and Black Seminoles remained in the deepest parts of the Everglades, unconquered. Chief Billy Bowlegs, among others, continued to lead them. They had become ghosts of the swamps, visible only when they wished to be, surviving off fish, coontie, deer, and wild berries. But peace did not last. The Third Seminole War erupted in 1855, sparked by conflict between American surveyors and Seminole families. Though smaller in scale, it again turned parts of South Florida into a battleground. Fort Dallas was reactivated. Soldiers returned, though now in smaller numbers. The war lasted 3 years, ending with more forced removals. But once again, a small group of Seminoles refused to leave. Their descendants remain in Florida today, living proof that neither the U.S. Army nor the vast forces of history ever fully erased them. By the time the Seminole Wars ended, the Miami River area lay nearly abandoned. The Tequesta were gone. The Seminole presence had retreated into the far interior. The Bahamian wreckers still passed through, but less frequently. Fort Dallas, once the beating heart of military operations, sat quietly on the riverbank. Its stone barracks weathered, its wooden structures decaying in the humid air. The land had been fought over, burned, drowned, abandoned, reclaimed by nature, and forgotten once again. But this long era of conflict had done something important, even if no one recognized it at the time. The wars forced the U.S. military to map the region, clearing trails, building outposts, and learning slowly to navigate the Everglades. They created the first American presence in Miami, however temporary. Fort Dallas became the first significant footprint of U.S. authority in the region. And though the swamps remained untamed, the war had opened the door to the next phase of Miami's transformation. For decades after the wars, the Miami area remained quiet, isolated, empty, waiting for someone with vision to see what it could become. The Seminoles still lived deep in the Everglades. Fort Dallas stood silent. But change was coming. Across the American South, railways were extending. Investors looked for new opportunities. And a woman named Julia Tuttle, who had never seen a Seminole warrior, never marched through the swamps, and never stood inside Fort Dallas during battle, would soon reshape the destiny of this place forever. And so the fires of war began to cool, leaving behind a landscape scarred but filled with possibility. The swamp that had once swallowed armies would become the foundation for a city. The river that once carried canoes into battle would carry trade, industry, and eventually cruise ships. And the land that had defied empires for centuries would finally find its moment. Chapter 5. Julia Tuttle, Henry Flagler, and the Birth of a City. When the smoke of the Seminole Wars finally drifted away, and the soldiers abandoned their wooden barracks along the Miami River, the land returned to silence. The fort decayed, vines creeping over stone walls. The river flowed as it always had, carrying memories of canoe trails now lost to time. The Tequesta were gone, the Spanish long forgotten, and the Seminoles living deep in the Everglades kept to themselves. For decades, the region existed in a strange limbo, beautiful, wild, and empty. Travelers passed through on boats bound for Key West. Bahamian wreckers still came after storms. A few hardy families tried their luck growing coconuts or limes. But nothing resembling a town took root. Miami, though the name was occasionally used on old survey maps, still did not exist. And then came the woman who would change everything. Julia Tuttle did not look like the founder of a future metropolis. She was not a general, not an explorer, not a railroad baron. She was a widow from Cleveland with a determined spirit, sharp intellect, and a belief, rare for her time, that a woman could shape the future of a place as profoundly as any man. After visiting South Florida in the 1870s, she fell in love with the Miami River's untamed beauty. When her husband died and her children grew older, she made a radical decision. She would move to this wilderness and transform it. In 1891, she purchased 640 acres of land surrounding the river, including the old Fort Dallas property. The plan was bold. The region was still nearly inaccessible by land. Supplies had to be shipped from Key West or traveled days overland from Lake Worth. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds thick enough to choke the air. Summers were brutal. Winters were mild but isolated. Most Americans in the late 19th century had never heard of the Miami River. Those who had regarded it as a forgotten corner of the country. But Julia Tuttle saw what others could not. She saw the river's potential as a port, the fertile land ready for farming, the bay capable of anchoring ships, and the untouched beauty that might one day attract visitors. She imagined tree-lined streets, homes, businesses, and a community thriving in a climate that knew no frost. But her dream had one impossible obstacle: isolation. Without a railroad, Miami could never become more than a scattering of farms. Far to the north, in cities like Jacksonville and St. Augustine, another visionary was shaping Florida's destiny. Henry Flagler, industrialist, partner of John D. Rockefeller, and co-founder of Standard Oil, had shifted his focus from oil to railroads and tourism. He built grand hotels along the East Coast: St. Augustine's Hotel Ponce de Leon, Ormond Beach's Hotel Ormond, and later the Royal Poinciana in Palm Beach. His Florida East Coast Railway pushed steadily southward, opening new towns along the coast like pearls on a string. But to Flagler, the Miami River area seemed too remote. too mosquito-infested, too empty to justify investment. The rails stopped far to the north. Miami appeared doomed to remain an overshadowed wilderness. Julia Tuttle refused to accept that. She wrote Flagler letters. She invited him to visit. She met with his associates. She argued that Miami would be the most important city in South Florida if only the railroad came. Flagler was polite, but unmoved. He had already invested heavily in Palm Beach and had no desire to push the rails into a land no one seemed eager to build in. And then, as if history itself intervened, came the Great Freeze of 1894 to 1895. It began with a brutal cold front sweeping across the southeastern United States. Temperatures plunged unexpectedly, destroying citrus groves from Georgia to central Florida. Orange trees cracked in the cold. Entire seasons of crops were lost overnight. Farmers watched decades of work vanish beneath a layer of frost. The economic devastation was immense. Newspapers called it the worst freeze in Florida's history. But as ice clung to branches across the state, something extraordinary happened along the Miami River. Nothing froze. South Florida, protected by warm ocean currents and its tropical environment, remained untouched. When the cold winds finally dissipated, farmers and investors from the north stood in shock. The only surviving citrus trees in Florida were growing in the land Julia Tuttle had been trying to promote. Sensing opportunity, she acted quickly. She cut branches from her unfrozen orange trees, wrapped them carefully, and sent them to Henry Flagler. A message accompanied the package. The freeze had spared Miami. The city she imagined was not just beautiful. It was resilient, fertile, and primed for growth. Flagler studied the branches. They were green and fresh. While every grove north of Palm Beach had been destroyed, Miami's remained alive. Suddenly, the wilderness he had dismissed became a land of promise, a climate-proof haven for agriculture and tourism. Julia Tuttle had not only persuaded him, she had proven him wrong. Flagler sent representatives to investigate. What they found astonished them. Rich soil, warm breezes, a navigable river, and a bay perfect for shipping. The region was empty enough to build a new city from scratch. And the woman who controlled its land was willing to partner with Flagler if he would bring the railroad. It was a deal too good to refuse. In 1895, Henry Flagler agreed to extend the Florida East Coast Railway to the Miami River. In exchange, Julia Tuttle offered land for a station, hotel, and other developments. Construction began immediately. Workers battled mosquitoes, swampy ground, and summer storms. Railroad ties were laid through wetlands. Bridges were built across rivers. Supply trains crawled slowly southward. Miami began to stir. Tuttle opened her home to workers, surveyors, and Flagler's engineers. Her house became a gathering place for meetings, negotiations, and celebrations as the railroad advanced. Meanwhile, settlers from across the country began arriving, hoping to claim land before prices rose. They built tents, small shacks, and temporary shelters. The Miami wilderness suddenly filled with voices, hammers, and dreams. By early 1896, the tracks reached the river. On April 13th, the first train steamed into the new station. Locals gathered to cheer, some crying in disbelief. After centuries of isolation, through Spanish rule, British rule, American takeover, and endless conflict, the Miami River had finally joined the modern world. The arrival of the railroad changed everything. Supplies arrived regularly. Farmers shipped crops north. Hotels began development. Workers poured in by the hundreds. Julia Tuttle's dream of a city was now inevitable. A committee formed to incorporate the new settlement. They debated the name, but there was little question. It would be called Miami, honoring the ancient peoples who first lived near the river. On July 28, 1896, 344 residents gathered and voted to incorporate the city of Miami. Of those voters, 162 were black residents, many Bahamians or black Americans who had moved south seeking opportunity. Their role in Miami's founding was significant, though history has not always given them their due. But on that day, in the sweltering heat of summer, they stood alongside white settlers and workers to create a new city. Henry Flagler was celebrated as its builder. His hotel, the Royal Palm, rose along the river near the site of the old fort. It was a massive structure, towering over the landscape, its elegance a symbol of Miami's potential. Guests arrived from the north seeking warmth during winter. They lounged under palm trees, sailed in Biscayne Bay, and marveled at the strange, exotic beauty of the tropics. But Julia Tuttle remained the heart of the story. Her vision, her insistence, her persistence had brought the railroad. She never lived to see the full flowering of the city she founded. She died in 1898, only 2 years after incorporation. But her influence shaped everything that followed. She is still remembered as the Mother of Miami, one of the few major American cities founded by a woman. Miami, once a forgotten wilderness, quickly became a boom town. Streets were laid out, businesses opened, and neighborhoods formed. Bahamian workers built many of the roads and early homes, creating communities like Coconut Grove and Colored Town, later Overtown. Steamboats carried goods between Miami and Key West. Trade with the Caribbean increased. Farmers planted grapefruit, tomatoes, and avocados, shipping them north on Flagler's trains. Yet even in its first years, the city carried the contradictions that would define it forever. Miami was a place of opportunity and exploitation, unity and segregation, beauty and brutality. Wealthy Northerners wintered in luxury at the Royal Palm, while black residents lived in overcrowded neighborhoods forced by segregation laws. Julia Tuttle's inclusive vision of a diverse community was quickly overshadowed by Jim Crow realities. The city grew, but not evenly. Still, the momentum was unstoppable. Miami's population surged, its port expanded. Its skyline, though modest, began to reflect ambition. The railroad continued pushing south toward Homestead and eventually Key West. Miami, once ignored by empires, had become the jewel of South Florida. At night, lanterns glowed along the river's edge. The hiss of locomotives echoed across the bay. The air carried the scent of citrus and salt. Visitors arriving by train stepped into a place unlike any other. Tropical, youthful, full of energy and possibility. But the forces that had shaped Miami's birth were only the beginning. The city would soon face cycles of explosive growth and catastrophic collapse. Hurricanes that would flatten neighborhoods, booms that would transform the skyline, and waves of immigrants who would rewrite its identity repeatedly. Miami would become a city reborn again and again, each time driven by new arrivals, new money, or new disasters. And as the 20th century dawned, the next great transformation was already on the horizon. A real estate frenzy unlike anything America had ever seen was coming. Dreams would rise with impossible speed, only to crash in spectacular fashion. Miami would soon experience its first boom and its first devastating fall. Chapter 6: The Roaring Twenties and Collapse. When the 20th century dawned over the Miami River, the city that Julia Tuttle dreamed of was still small, humid, and raw. A frontier town with dusty streets, palm thatch houses, and a single grand hotel towering over everything else. But Miami possessed something few American cities had: youth. It had no old elite guarding power, no entrenched institutions resisting change, no long-established families dictating the city's direction. Everyone who came to Miami came to build something new. That spirit made the city fertile ground for a phenomenon that would soon define an era: the Florida land boom. It did not begin suddenly. Throughout the 1910s, Miami grew steadily. New neighborhoods appeared on platted grids. Workers from the Bahamas, Georgia, and the Caribbean filled the labor ranks. Wealthy Northerners wintered at the Royal Palm and at newer hotels rising along the bay. But something shifted after World War I. Soldiers returned home dreaming of sun. Northern cities felt crowded, industrial, cold. Magazines published images of Florida's palm-lined beaches, turquoise water, and endless sunshine. The idea of Florida, warm, glamorous, exotic, became irresistible. Miami was the epicenter of that fantasy. Developers arrived by the dozen. Real estate offices multiplied along Flagler Street. Advertisements in Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia promised fortune to anyone willing to buy a plot in paradise. The climate, they said, made Miami the future of America. Some ads barely mentioned the city at all. They simply showed palm trees and smiling families on beaches, implying that any plot of land, anywhere near Miami, would turn into wealth overnight. Investors believed it. Trains from the north arrived packed with prospectors, businessmen, newlyweds, retirees, con artists, architects, and dreamers. Men stepped onto the platforms wearing suits and straw hats. Women carried parasols and hand luggage. They walked off the trains with big plans. Buy land, flip it, get rich. In those early days of the boom, it was possible. Lots purchased for a few $100s could be sold days later for thousands. Prices doubled, tripled, sometimes in a single afternoon. People bought land sight unseen. Some sold property that didn't even exist yet, swamp plots advertised as future city centers. The city struggled to keep up. Streets couldn't be built fast enough. Cars clogged the few existing roads. Construction crews worked day and night. Wooden scaffolding sprouted everywhere. Two-story homes, hotels, and storefronts rose. Sometimes finished, often abandoned halfway through when the owner flipped the land to someone else. Miami became a giant, living construction site. A place where wealth seemed to materialize out of thin air. Amid the frenzy, a new artistic style began to appear, one that would later define the region: Art Deco. At first, it was subtle. Simple geometric facades, sunburst motifs, pastel colors. But the seeds were planted. Architects from the north saw Miami as a place where bold ideas could flourish. The city was young enough to absorb experimentation, vibrant enough to inspire it. Though Miami's iconic Art Deco district would not fully blossom until the 1930s. Its foundations were laid during this period of optimism and extravagance. Hotels catered to millionaires, celebrities, and socialites. Fisher Island became a refuge for the ultra-rich. Carl Fisher, a visionary automobile tycoon, invested millions building causeways, canals, and luxury developments. He transformed barren sandbars into glittering playgrounds. Boats ferried guests to extravagant parties. Jazz floated across Biscayne Bay. Newspapers declared Miami the Magic City. a nickname born from its ability to reinvent itself faster than anyone could imagine. But beneath the glamour, the warning signs were already appearing. By 1925, the pace had become unsustainable. Too many developments, too few roads. The rail lines were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of building materials. One day in 1925, so many rail cars filled the tracks that they stretched for miles, unable to move. Ships waiting to unload at the port backed up in Biscayne Bay. Supplies piled up on wharves. Lumber shortages became critical. Builders ran out of nails, pipes, and concrete. Prices skyrocketed. Construction slowed. Then the bubble cracked. It started with something as simple as a traffic jam at the port. A large steamship got stuck in the channel, blocking access for days. Cargo ships couldn't unload building materials, and hundreds of buyers waiting for new homes suddenly found their projects delayed indefinitely. Confidence faltered. People started to question whether Miami could sustain its wild promises. Meanwhile, the national press shifted its tone. Stories about incredible real estate profits gave way to exposés about fraud, overinflated prices, and unfinished developments. Skepticism, once impossible to find, now spread quickly. Investors who had never set foot in Florida began to reconsider. Money dried up. Contracts fell through. Land offices closed. Miami's real estate machine, which had grown too fast for its own good, began to wheeze. But the true collapse came not from economics, but from the sky. On September 18, 1926, just before dawn, the air over Miami turned heavy and still. The bay grew strangely calm. Birds disappeared. Residents sensed something was wrong. Those who had lived through storms before felt dread simmering beneath the quiet. And then, from the Atlantic, the 1926 Miami hurricane arrived. It was a monster, one of the most powerful storms ever recorded at that time, slamming into the city with winds estimated over 140 miles per hour. The eye passed directly over downtown Miami. First came the roar. Trees snapped. Roofs peeled away like paper. Buildings shuddered. Wooden houses collapsed. Waves surged over Miami Beach, sweeping inland with terrifying speed. Boats were hurled across roads and into houses. Train cars toppled. Streets turned into rivers. Palm trees, symbols of paradise, were uprooted, thrown into cars, storefronts, and hotel lobbies. During the brief calm as the eye passed overhead, survivors emerged from hiding, believing the storm was over. Children played in flooded streets. Families began gathering belongings. Little did they know the storm's second half was moments away. When it hit, wind slammed from the opposite direction with renewed brutality. Debris from the first half of the storm became lethal projectiles. Entire neighborhoods vanished. When the winds finally subsided, the scale of destruction became clear. Thousands of buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. Rail lines were torn apart. Roads were impassable. Telephone and telegraph wires dangled in heaps. More than 370 people died, likely far more, as many victims were unreported Bahamian workers living in temporary quarters. Miami, once the symbol of American optimism, now looked like a war zone. And just like that, the boom was over. Investors fled. Insurance companies collapsed. Banks failed. The population dropped as families packed what little they had left and returned north. Newspapers, which had once praised Miami as the future, now portrayed it as a cautionary tale. The national appetite for Florida land evaporated almost overnight. Without investment, the city struggled to rebuild. Many developments were abandoned permanently. Miami Beach, once the glittering playground of the elite, lay in ruins. Mangled piers, flattened hotels, and sand covering entire streets. The collapse reverberated through every layer of society. Workers found themselves unemployed. Developers declared bankruptcy. Some of Miami's early visionaries lost their fortunes entirely. Carl Fisher never recovered financially from the double blow of speculation collapse and hurricane destruction. The city he helped build kept growing, but not under his leadership. Miami teetered on the edge of disappearing back into the swamp. The dream of the magic city seemed fragile, perhaps even foolish. Had the ambitions of the 1920s simply moved too fast? Had the promise of paradise blinded investors to the land's natural power? But Miami had one advantage that no storm or economic crash could erase. The climate remained irresistible. Even in ruins, Miami was warm, alluring, and full of potential. Winters were pleasant. The ocean sparkled. The land, battered but not broken, still promised life. And slowly, painfully, the city began to pull itself together. Rebuilding took years. The late 1920s were difficult. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, hit Miami just as the city was trying to recover. Construction slowed to a crawl. Tourism declined sharply. Many Art Deco ideas remained on drawing boards, waiting for better times. Miami's future felt uncertain, suspended in a limbo between promise and failure. Yet even in this bleak period, the seeds of a new identity were taking root. Architects and planners studying the ruins began imagining a new kind of Miami, one shaped by style, color, and modern design, rather than purely speculation. Young artists and designers settled in the area, drawn by cheap rents and beautiful scenery. The earliest hints of the iconic South Beach aesthetic began to shimmer faintly in the imagination of a city still mourning its losses. Miami had survived the hurricane. It had survived the burst of the bubble. It had survived the collapse of its first great dream. And while the following decade would bring challenges that tested the entire nation, Miami was learning a lesson that would define its character forever. Rebirth was not a rare event here. It was a constant process. The Magic City would rise again. And the next time it did, it would rise faster, stronger, and with a style that would capture the world's imagination. As the 1930s approached, the quiet rebuilding gave way to something transformative. A new era of military significance, aviation glory, global connections, and the dawn of Miami as the gateway to the Americas. Chapter 7. World War II, Airfields, and America's New Gateway. When the 1930s faded and the storm clouds of war began to gather across Europe, Miami was still a city rebuilding its identity. The hurricane of 1926 had shattered the early boom. The Great Depression had drained its energy further. Hotels stood half empty. Construction slowed. The city felt as if it were holding its breath. And yet, beneath the surface, something was stirring. An undercurrent of possibility waiting for the right spark. That spark would come from a source no one could have predicted. World War II. Before the war, Miami's greatest natural asset, its geographical position, was still more theoretical than practical. It was close to the Caribbean, facing the Atlantic, linked to Latin America by sea routes and by a growing fascination with tropical travel. But Miami had not yet become the international hub that would ultimately define its future. That transformation began the moment the United States just entered the war. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Miami was thrust overnight into a role of national significance. Suddenly, this young, warm, strategically located city was exactly what the U.S. military needed. Its climate was ideal for year-round training. Its coastline provided quick access to deep water. Its proximity to the Caribbean made it a perfect base for anti-submarine patrols. And its wide, flat expanses of land were perfect for airfields. Almost immediately, Miami changed from a resort destination into a wartime machine. Hotels that once welcomed wealthy winter tourists were converted into barracks and training centers. The massive Biltmore Hotel in Coral Gables, once the height of luxury, became a military hospital. The Nautilus Hotel on Miami Beach was transformed into a training school for the Army Air Forces. Officers marched down Collins Avenue. Recruits lounged on hotel verandas where vacationers once sipped cocktails. Instead of beach umbrellas, rifle racks lined the sand. Miami Beach, in particular, became an enormous training camp. Nearly every hotel from 5th Street to 43rd Street was taken over by the military. Tens of thousands of soldiers arrived. Young men from New York, Chicago, Kansas, Alabama, and everywhere between. They ran drills on golf courses, learned aircraft mechanics in ballrooms, and practiced maneuvers in hotel courtyards. The elegant Mediterranean revival architecture became the backdrop to a city filled with uniforms, barking sergeants, and the constant rumble of aircraft overhead. The transformation was surreal. Miami Beach, once associated with music, swimming, and sunbathing, now echoed with marching boots and reveille. Soldiers trained on the sand at sunrise. They waded into the surf carrying full packs. They ran obstacle courses built on what had once been quiet, manicured lawns. And at night, the lights along Ocean Drive were dimmed to avoid drawing the attention of German submarines lurking offshore. Because they were there, very real, very close, and very deadly. During the early years of the war, German U-boats patrolled the Florida Straits, targeting American merchant ships crossing to Cuba or sailing toward the Panama Canal. Flames from torpedoed vessels lit the night sky. Oil washed ashore. Survivors were rescued by fishermen or Coast Guard cutters. The war was no distant concept for Miami. It was visible from the beach. In response, the U.S. Navy expanded its presence. Dinner Key, once a seaplane base, became a hub for patrol aircraft. The Coast Guard grew dramatically, using Miami as a base for anti-submarine operations. Airfields sprang up across the region. Homestead Army Airfield, Miami Army Airfield, Richmond Naval Air Station, and smaller fields scattered inland. Pilots trained constantly, practicing takeoffs and landings, navigation, gunnery, and formation flying. The roar of engines became the soundtrack of the city. The influx of military personnel changed Miami's demographics almost overnight. Tens of thousands of young men, many visiting Florida for the first time, discovered tropical breezes, palm trees, warm water, and a city unlike anything in the northern states. They trained, worked, marched, and nursed wounds in Miami's hospitals. And many of them made a quiet promise to themselves. When the war was over, they would come back. But the wartime transformation was not only military. Miami became a critical hub for intelligence and diplomacy. Britain's Security Coordination Office set up operations in the city. Latin American leaders visited more frequently. The U.S. government realized that Miami's location made it the perfect gateway for hemispheric cooperation. Air links expanded between Miami, Havana, Nassau, and Central and South America. Pan American Airways, headquartered at Dinner Key, became a symbol of this new era. flying clippers across the Caribbean, delivering mail, diplomats, intelligence officers, cargo, and occasionally covert operatives. Those Pan Am Clipper flights were iconic symbols of a world transitioning into the age of international air travel. Passengers boarded massive seaplanes that lifted off from Biscayne Bay, their engines echoing across the water as they skimmed into the sky. The routes connected Miami to Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Kingston, San Juan, and beyond. Miami was no longer just a city at the edge of the United States. It was becoming a crossroads between continents. Meanwhile, locals adjusted to the wartime changes with surprising resilience. Black residents who had long been restricted to Overtown suddenly saw new opportunities. Jobs at airfields, shipyards, and military supply depots. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, replacing men who had joined the service. Restaurants stayed open around the clock to serve soldiers. Miami's nightlife evolved, with USO clubs, dance halls, and theaters providing entertainment to lonely servicemen far from home. Even segregation, though still present, was strained under the pressure of war. Black soldiers trained in Miami, too, often in separate units, often under discriminatory conditions. But they were nonetheless part of the vast military machine reshaping the city. Tensions existed, but so did moments of cooperation and shared purpose. The war years gave Miami a taste of what it could become. Bustling, modern, filled with energy, connected to the world, and constantly in motion. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the war ended. Soldiers returned from Europe and the Pacific. Planes flew home. Bases were decommissioned. Barracks emptied. But Miami did not return to what it had been before. The transformation was irreversible. Many of the young men who trained in Miami came back, not as soldiers, but as civilians wanting a new life. They brought their families. They bought homes. They started businesses. Developers rushed to build housing for the influx. Suburbs expanded. Roads lengthened. Schools multiplied. Miami's population surged, nearly doubling between 1940 and 1950. Veterans remembered Miami not as a battlefield, but as a place of sunshine, hope, recovery, and possibility. For them, the city represented the beginning of a new chapter in life. And they chose to stay. The military presence also left infrastructure the city desperately needed. Airfields became airports. Richmond Naval Air Station became part of the region's aviation network. Homestead Army Airfield evolved into the crucial military base, Homestead Air Force Base. And Miami Army Airfield became, after years of expansion and modernization, Miami International Airport. This was the turning point. With a major airport and established international routes, Miami stepped into a new identity, America's aerial door to Latin America and the Caribbean. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, air travel began its golden age. Commercial airlines expanded routes across the hemisphere. Miami sat perfectly positioned to serve as the gateway between the U.S. mainland and the southern half of the Western Hemisphere. Pan Am continued its dominance. Eastern Airlines established major operations in Miami. Every year, more travelers passed through the city: tourists, businessmen, diplomats, musicians, artists, and migrants. Spanish and Portuguese filled the air. Caribbean accents shaped the rhythms of daily life. Miami became multicultural not by slow evolution, but by geographic inevitability. It was the first major American city where Latin influence was not a subculture, but a defining force. The Cold War amplified this trend. The U.S. government used Miami as a staging point for political, intelligence, and diplomatic operations across Latin America. Exiles, activists, journalists, and spies moved through the city. New communities formed, some temporary, others permanent. The city became a magnet for people fleeing upheaval in their home countries. The veterans who stayed built the physical Miami of the mid-20th century. But the immigrants who arrived built its soul. By the 1950s, Miami was no longer just a tropical escape. It was a bustling metropolis with a dynamic culture blending American, Caribbean, and Latin influences. New hotels rose along the beach, now designed in the elegant, kinetic language of Art Deco. Nightclubs thrived. Theaters flourished. Restaurants introduced flavors from Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Brazil. Tourists poured in, drawn by the allure of sun, music, and an increasingly international atmosphere. World War II had turned Miami into something it had never been before: essential. The war brought soldiers. The soldiers brought families. The military brought airfields. The airfields brought international travel. And travel brought the world to Miami. The city's growth was not smooth. Segregation persisted. Housing shortages intensified. Hurricanes still threatened. Corruption crept into politics. But none of these challenges slowed Miami's momentum. The city had discovered its purpose: to connect nations, cultures, and people. And it embraced that destiny with unstoppable speed. By the end of the 1950s, Miami was poised for another transformation, one even more dramatic than the land boom of the 1920s or the military surge of the 1940s. Forces beyond the city's control were gathering off the coast of Florida. A revolution would soon topple Havana's government. Refugees would flee by the thousands. And Miami, already the gateway to Latin America, would become the capital of a diaspora that reshaped everything from its politics to its cuisine. The city was ready for its next rebirth. Chapter 8. Cubans transform the city. By the late 1950s, Miami had already begun to evolve into an international crossroads, its post-war boom fueled by returning veterans, expanding air routes, and a growing sense that the city served as America's window to the Caribbean and Latin America. But nothing, not the land boom, not the hurricane of 1926, not even World War II, would transform Miami as profoundly as what happened 90 miles across the water. In 1959, Havana fell. The Cuban Revolution, which had simmered in the mountains and cities for years, finally toppled the Batista regime. A young, charismatic revolutionary named Fidel Castro entered Havana on New Year's Day, waving to crowds of cheering supporters. To many in Cuba, it was the dawn of hope. To others, landowners, political dissidents, business elites, professionals, and anyone associated with the old order, it was the beginning of catastrophe. They watched as the new government consolidated power, seized industries, silenced opposition, and aligned itself with the Soviet Union. Fear spread quickly, and as that fear grew, thousands of Cubans looked north across the water and saw Miami. Miami had been a tropical city before, a military training ground, a gateway for Pan Am clippers. But now, as the revolution swept through the island, Miami became something entirely new, a refuge. At first, the arrivals came in waves that seemed temporary. Well-dressed families stepped off flights from Havana, carrying suitcases full of clothing and heirlooms, expecting to return when the political chaos calmed. Many were wealthy, educated, and accustomed to cosmopolitan life in Havana, the Paris of the Caribbean. They rented apartments along Biscayne Boulevard or moved into modest homes in emerging suburbs. They believed their exile would last months, perhaps a year at most. But the months turned into years. Castro's government moved aggressively, nationalizing industries, confiscating private property, and executing or imprisoning opponents. As the Cold War deepened, the United States severed ties with Cuba. The line between the island and Miami hardened. For those who had fled, the possibility of returning home slipped away. The first major refugee wave reshaped Miami almost overnight. Spanish became common on the streets. Cuban restaurants opened, filling the air with the scent of Café Cubano and lechon. Newspapers printed bilingual editions. Churches offered services in both languages. Neighborhoods that were once quiet Anglo enclaves filled with new families who brought their culture, traditions, and ambitions. Little Havana was born. It was not built intentionally. It emerged naturally. Cuban families clustering around Southwest 8th Street, Calle Ocho, establishing grocery stores, bakeries, music shops, and cafeterias. The neighborhood quickly became the spiritual center of Cuban exile life. Domino tables appeared in parks, roosters crowed in backyards. Spanish music poured from open windows. The smell of tobacco and the sound of laughter filled the warm air. Little Havana was not simply a place to live. It was a declaration. If we cannot return home, we will recreate it here. But the most remarkable chapter of this transformation began with the children. In 1960, rumors spread across Cuba that the revolutionary government intended to indoctrinate children and remove parental authority. Whether true or amplified by fear, the rumor ignited panic. Parents faced an impossible choice: keep their children in Cuba or send them away to an uncertain future abroad. And so began Operation Pedro Pan, the largest child exodus in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Between 1960 and 1962, more than 14,000 Cuban children were flown out of the island, many without their parents, in a covert program supported by the Catholic Church, the U.S. government, and Cuban exile networks. The flights landed in Miami, where children were placed in temporary shelters, camps, foster homes, and orphanages, while waiting, often for years, for their parents to escape. Imagine the scene. Small children clutching suitcases, stepping off airplanes into the bright Florida sun. Some cried, some were silent. Many carried photographs of parents they would not see again for a long time. Volunteers greeted them with warm meals, clean beds, and the hope that their sacrifice would eventually reunite their families. For Miami, Operation Pedro Pan became a symbol of humanitarian compassion and a stark reminder of the political upheaval taking place just across the sea. As the Cold War intensified, Cuban exiles in Miami became important political actors. They organized anti-Castro groups, established newspapers, and held rallies calling for the liberation of Cuba. Radio stations broadcast messages of resistance. Secret training camps appeared in the Everglades and the Keys. Young exiles trained with weapons, imagining a return to the island to overthrow the regime. In 1961, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion only deepened this political fervor. Many of the exiles who had trained with the CIA and fought in the invasion returned to Miami devastated, furious, and determined. The city became a global center of anti-communist activism. Politicians visited regularly, seeking support from the exile community. Miami was no longer a distant city in the American South. It had become the front line in the ideological battle of the Cold War. Meanwhile, refugees kept arriving. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, The U.S. and Cuban governments agreed to establish the Freedom Flights program. Between 1965 and 1973, an average of 2 flights per day brought Cuban families to Miami. Nearly 300,000 people in total. They arrived weary, grateful, and determined to rebuild their lives. They filled schools, churches, and workplaces. They bought homes, opened businesses, and established what would become one of the most powerful and successful immigrant communities in American history. Miami's population surged. Spanish became a dominant language. The city's culture began to transform, not gradually, but immediately and unmistakably. Anglo residents who had lived in Miami for decades felt overwhelmed. Many moved north to Broward County in a shift often called the White Flight of the 1960s and 70s. This migration accelerated Miami's demographic transformation and left Cubans as the new majority in many neighborhoods. Economically, Cubans revitalized Miami. They opened banks, restaurants, supermarkets, and import-export companies. They created newspapers, radio stations, and television channels that catered to Spanish-speaking audiences. Cuban physicians, lawyers, engineers, and academics rebuilt their careers in exile. The entrepreneurial drive that had defined Cuban society before the revolution now powered Miami's ascent. Entire business districts flourished on the energy of exiles who had arrived with nothing but skills, ambition, and the memory of a lost homeland. Politically, the Cuban community became a force no one could ignore. Exile leaders lobbied Washington for harder stances against Castro. Anti-communist organizations multiplied. U.S. presidents, from Kennedy to Reagan, visited Miami to speak directly to exiles. Campaigns for city and county offices increasingly required the support of Cuban voters. The struggle for Cuba's future became intertwined with Miami's own identity. But beneath the political activism and economic success lay a deep emotional undercurrent, a longing for home that permeated daily life. Exiles gathered in cafes to discuss news from the island. They celebrated Cuban holidays, danced to Cuban music, and told stories of Havana's Malecón, El Vedado, and Miramar. Children grew up listening to tales of a Cuba they had never seen. Miami became a city sustained by nostalgia, grief, resilience, and the belief that one day, somehow, they would return. This emotional landscape shaped everything. From family dinners to street festivals, from political campaigns to neighborhood identities, Calle Ocho became a cultural artery pulsing with memory and hope, decorated with murals of Cuban heroes, flags waving from balconies, and the aroma of Cuban coffee drifting through the streets. As Cubans established themselves in Miami, they also brought new expectations of security, prosperity, and opportunity. They demanded better schools, safer streets, and stronger political representation. Miami's government responded slowly at first, but eventually adapted to the new reality. By the 1970s, Spanish-language signage, bilingual education, and cultural festivals were woven into the city's fabric. But not all of Miami's communities benefited equally. The city's black residents, many of whom had been in Miami since the early 1900s, watched the rapid influx of Cuban newcomers with mixed emotions. Some welcomed the cultural richness. Others resented the sense that Cubans were receiving more support from the federal government than African Americans had ever been given. This tension would erupt later in the century, leaving a lasting mark on Miami's social landscape. Still, by the end of the 1970s, one thing was clear. Miami had become the capital in exile for Cuban culture. The city was no longer simply in America. In many ways, it was Cuba, reborn, reimagined, and thriving, yet shadowed always by the island it had left behind. The Cuban Revolution had reshaped Miami more dramatically than any event since the arrival of the railroad. It changed the language, the politics, the economy, the cuisine, the identity, and the future of the city. And the transformation was far from over. More waves of migration were coming, from Haiti, Nicaragua, Colombia, Venezuela, and each would leave its own imprint. But first, Miami would face a reckoning much closer to home. Even as Cuban culture flourished, the city's longtime black communities, overcrowded, neglected, and repeatedly displaced by urban development, grew desperate for justice. The fault lines created by segregation, police brutality, and political marginalization were deepening. The next chapter of Miami's story would not be written by exiles fleeing communism or soldiers training for war. It would be written by the communities who had lived through every transformation and yet remained unseen, until the day their anger shook the city to its core. Chapter 9: Liberty City, Overtown, and the Struggle for Equality. As Miami became the capital in exile for Cuban culture, its skyline rising, its Spanish accents thickening, and its economic engine accelerating, another Miami existed just a few miles away. One older, deeper, hidden beneath the shining image the city projected to the world. It was the Miami built by those who laid the first tracks for Flagler's Railroad, who carried bricks to construction sites, who cooked meals in the grand hotels, who played the jazz that filled Miami's nights, and who lived through every transformation, yet reaped the smallest share of the city's prosperity. These were the black communities of Overtown, and later, Liberty City. Their story is not the story usually told in tourist brochures or celebratory histories of Miami's growth. It is the story of a people who built the city while being pushed aside, who endured segregation even as Miami sold itself as an international gateway, who kept their culture alive even as their neighborhoods were carved apart, and who eventually rose up when the weight of injustice became too much to bear. To understand Miami's black history, you must begin in the early 20th century, long before the Cuban Revolution, long before Miami's skyscrapers reflected the sun. When the Florida East Coast Railway arrived in 1896, it brought thousands of Bahamian and African-American laborers. They cleared the swamps, laid track, built bridges, and erected the Royal Palm Hotel. They worked in a city they were not fully allowed to inhabit. Segregation laws confined them to a designated colored town west of the railroad tracks, a neighborhood later known as Overtown. Overtown was more than a place of restriction. It was a community, vibrant, culturally rich, and full of life. In the 1920s and 30s, Overtown was the heart of Black Miami, a world within a world, shaped by both hardship and creativity. It was home to churches, barber shops, restaurants, mom-and-pop stores, jazz clubs, and theaters. Famous musicians who performed for white audiences on Miami Beach, artists like Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Nat King Cole, were not allowed to stay on the beach overnight, so they came to Overtown after their shows, where they played into the early hours in smoky clubs filled with locals who knew music intimately. Overtown became known as the Harlem of the South, a place where culture thrived even under the weight of segregation. But while Overtown's cultural life flourished, its infrastructure crumbled. City leaders refused to invest in the neighborhood. Housing was overcrowded, streets were poorly maintained. Public transportation was limited. Police presence was often more about control than safety. Yet the people of Overtown persisted. raising families, running businesses, and sustaining a community that was both marginalized and resilient. The real destruction, however, came not from neglect, but from concrete. In the 1950s and 60s, Miami, like many American cities, embraced the era of highway construction with enthusiasm. Federal money poured into new interstate systems. Planners saw Overtown as an easy target for expansion. Densely populated, politically weak, and, in their view, expendable. Interstate 95 cut through the heart of the neighborhood. Northwest 7th Avenue was widened. Ramps, overpasses, and interchanges carved Overtown into fragments. More than 20,000 residents were displaced. Businesses closed. Churches lost their congregations. Families were forced to move to newly built but underfunded housing projects farther north, into what would become Liberty City. The destruction of Overtown is one of Miami's greatest tragedies. A neighborhood that once pulsed with music, culture, and history was torn apart in the name of progress. Highways isolated what remained. The community collapsed. Streets that once hosted jazz legends and bustling weekend crowds grew quiet. Buildings decayed. Hope faded. The displaced residents who moved into Liberty City carried with them the memory of what Overtown had been and the pain of what it had become. Liberty City was built in the late 1930s as one of the first government-funded housing projects in the United States. At first, it offered opportunity, new homes, more space, and a chance to build a fresh community. But without investment, maintenance, or economic support, Liberty City soon became a symbol of systemic neglect. By the 1970s, Miami was experiencing a demographic revolution. The Cuban influx, Latin American migration, and white flight reshaped the social order. Many Cuban exiles rose quickly into the middle class, aided by federal programs aimed at resettlement and Cold War diplomacy. Meanwhile, Black Miamians, many of whose families had been in the city for 3 generations, saw little improvement in their own circumstances. Unemployment rose. Housing deteriorated. Schools remained underfunded. Police-community relations grew increasingly tense. Black residents watched as Miami enjoyed an economic boom led by tourism, banking, and international trade. Yet few promised benefits reached Liberty City or the remnants of Overtown. The divide between tourist Miami and local Miami grew wider each year. The tipping point came in 1980. On December 17, 1979, Arthur McDuffie, a black insurance salesman and former Marine, was beaten to death by a group of white Miami-Dade police officers after a motorcycle chase. The officers attempted to cover up the incident, claiming McDuffie had crashed. But the truth eventually surfaced. He had been struck repeatedly with flashlights and nightsticks, suffering fatal injuries. When the officers were tried, the case was moved to Tampa. And on May 17, 1980, after a short deliberation, an all-white jury acquitted them. News of the verdict reached Miami in the evening. The reaction was immediate. In Liberty City, crowds gathered. Anger, long simmering from decades of segregation, displacement, discrimination, and police violence, erupted into the open. What followed became one of the most intense civil disturbances in American history. The McDuffie riots lasted 3 days. Cars were overturned and burned. Stores were looted. Buildings went up in flames. Streets became battlegrounds. Police struggled to control the situation. Florida Highway Patrol units were deployed. The National Guard rolled in with armored vehicles. Helicopters hovered overhead. Journalists described the scene as a war zone. 18 people died. Hundreds were injured. Millions of dollars in damage swept through Liberty City and surrounding neighborhoods. The scars, physical and emotional, ran deep. Yet the riots did something unexpected. They forced the rest of Miami to confront the inequality it had long ignored. For decades, politicians, business leaders, and tourism boards had projected an image of Miami as a multicultural paradise, a sunny playground, a welcoming international city. But Liberty City told a different story, a city divided by race, economics, opportunity, and memory. In the years that followed, Miami faced a choice: rebuild Liberty City and address systemic injustice, or allow inequality to deepen. The results were mixed. Some investments came: new housing, new businesses, new civic initiatives. But they were inconsistent, often underfunded, and sometimes more symbolic than transformative. Still, the people of Liberty City and Overtown continued to fight for their communities. Churches organized empowerment programs. Activists pushed for fair policing, better schools, and economic opportunities. Cultural institutions, like the Lyric Theater in Overtown, were restored as symbols of pride. Jazz festivals returned. Writers, poets, and musicians told the story of Black Miami with renewed strength. The civil rights movement in Miami was never a single moment. It was a long, grinding struggle carried out through marches, lawsuits, advocacy groups, and quiet acts of perseverance. Black Miamians gained representation in local government. Police reforms, though uneven, began to take shape. Community organizers continued to push for justice long after national headlines faded. Through hardship and resilience, Liberty City and Overtown became symbols of both Miami's injustice and its courage. Their stories were not separable from Miami's history. They were integral to it. The city could not understand itself without understanding what happened to these neighborhoods. As the 1980s closed, Miami stood transformed yet again. Cuban exiles dominated politics. Latin American investment fueled growth. Tourism rebounded after years of turmoil. And Black Miami, though still fighting inequality, had forged a legacy of activism that demanded to be heard. But even as Miami confronted its past, the city faced new challenges on the horizon. Globalization, immigration waves, the drug economy, and cultural changes that would reshape every neighborhood. The next chapter would plunge Miami into both darkness and reinvention. Cocaine money flooded the streets. Violence surged. Miami became infamous around the world, and the city would once again be forced to grapple with who it was and who it wanted to become. Chapter 10: Cocaine Cowboys, Corruption, and the 1980s Wild Frontier. When the smoke of the McDuffie riots eventually settled over Liberty City, Miami was a city shaken, searching for stability. But instead of finding calm, the 1980s delivered one of the most turbulent and explosive eras in its history. The struggles over segregation and equality had exposed deep wounds. Yet before those could heal, a new force flooded the streets: cocaine. And with it came unimaginable wealth, unchecked violence, and a level of corruption so pervasive that it would reshape Miami's image across the world. If the early 20th century had been marked by booms, busts, hurricanes, and immigration, the 1980s were defined by one thing: the drug trade. The Miami of Scarface was not an exaggeration. It was a reflection. Neon lights and pastel buildings hid a shadow economy larger than anyone had imagined. The city became the primary gateway for cocaine entering the United States, and that single fact transformed everything. It began quietly. Colombian trafficking networks, having perfected the production of pure cocaine in the Andes and refined distribution routes through the Caribbean, needed a safe and efficient entry point into the U.S. The solution was obvious. Miami was close, geographically. Its airport had grown into an international hub. Its coastline was long and porous. Its financial sector was expanding rapidly. And its law enforcement agencies were understaffed, fragmented, and overwhelmed. The Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar and his associates, saw opportunity in every direction. Miami's banks offered minimal oversight. Its real estate market welcomed foreign cash without question. Its politics were distracted by racial conflict, Cold War immigration, and civil unrest. Into this chaos flowed a river of white powder. At first, the traffickers were discreet. Small shipments hidden in suitcases or tucked into speedboats. But demand in the United States skyrocketed with staggering speed. Cocaine became the drug of the wealthy. Glamorous, expensive, and socially acceptable in the nightlife of Manhattan, Los Angeles, and Miami Beach. With demand exploding, the cartels scaled their operations. Soon, speedboats raced across the Caribbean under cover of night, packed with hundreds of kilos of cocaine. Commercial flights carried drugs in hidden compartments. Fishermen were paid fortunes to smuggle shipments. Entire neighborhoods became safe houses. The money was unlike anything Miami had ever seen. The city had boomed before, but never like this. Drug money poured into banks. Fortunes were deposited in duffel bags and suitcases. It became common for bankers to accept millions in cash, with no questions asked. Some banks even installed counting machines in their lobbies to handle the influx. Miami became the money laundering capital of the Western Hemisphere. On the streets, the effects were immediate. Traffic jams of brand new luxury cars became common. Nightclubs thrived. Restaurants filled with patrons paying in cash. Real estate developers sold homes and condos to buyers who never asked about inspections or appraisals. They paid up front, in bills wrapped with rubber bands. But the prosperity came at a cost no one could ignore. The cocaine trade was ruthless. Competition between traffickers grew violent. Disputes were settled not with lawsuits, but with bullets. The murder rate soared. Miami suddenly became one of the most dangerous cities in the United States. The violence was not hidden in alleyways. It erupted in public spaces in broad daylight, with a brazenness that shocked the nation. The most infamous moment came on July 11th, 1979. In the middle of a busy weekday, two gunmen armed with automatic weapons stormed into the Dadeland Mall liquor store. They riddled it with bullets, executed a Colombian rival, and sprayed the parking lot with gunfire. Shoppers fled in terror. Bullet holes peppered cars and windows. The attackers escaped in a van with a machine gun turret bolted inside. The message was clear. Miami had become a battleground. Newspapers dubbed the perpetrators cocaine cowboys, a term that captured the recklessness and frontier lawlessness of the era. The name stuck, and the Miami drug wars became the subject of national fascination. Reporters embedded themselves in Miami to document the chaos. News broadcasts showed scenes of shootouts, drug busts, and armored police raids. The cartels were not satisfied with simply moving product. They wanted total control. They bribed police officers, prosecutors, and politicians. Some officers accepted money to look the other way. Others joined trafficking rings outright. Entire units within the Miami Police Department collapsed under corruption investigations. At one point, more than 10% of the force was under scrutiny or indictment. Even legitimate officials struggled to keep up. The homicide office was overwhelmed, its morgue overflowing. The medical examiner's office had to rent refrigerated trucks to store bodies during peak waves of violence. The city was drowning in cocaine, blood, and cash. Meanwhile, Miami's image began to split in two. There was the glamorous Miami, nightclubs on South Beach, neon signs illuminating Ocean Drive, models and celebrities partying under palm trees. The wealthy and powerful flocked to these spaces. Some rubbed shoulders with traffickers who treated the city as their playground. Others simply enjoyed the luxurious nightlife that the cocaine economy indirectly fueled. And then there was the Miami of fear. Quiet neighborhoods shaken by gunfire, businesses threatened by extortion, and families caught in the crossfire of a war they had nothing to do with. Yet despite the danger, Miami continued to grow. Why? Because the money kept flowing, because the weather was beautiful, because the city had always attracted dreamers, wanderers, and entrepreneurs. And because Miami, even in its darkest moments, possessed an irresistible allure. The drug war did not stop tourists from sunbathing on the beach or wealthy investors from building high-rise condos. The duality of Miami, glamour and violence, paradise and peril, only made it more intriguing in the eyes of the world. And it was in this tense, chaotic environment that the Colombian presence in Miami deepened into something more permanent. Colombian immigrants, most unrelated to the cartels, fled political violence, economic hardship, and cartel terror in their homeland. They arrived in Miami seeking safety and opportunity. They built restaurants, shops, and businesses. They established neighborhoods like Sweetwater and Kendall. They contributed to Miami's cultural mosaic even as the cartel's violence cast a long shadow over their reputation. By the mid-1980s, law enforcement finally mounted a more coordinated response. Federal agencies, DEA, FBI, Customs, formed task forces. Undercover operations increased. Sting operations intensified. High-speed boat chases filled the waters around Miami. Helicopters patrolled the skies. With time, the most violent cartel operatives were captured or killed. Some were extradited. Others fled back to Colombia. The most notorious Miami-based traffickers, figures like Griselda Blanco, the cocaine godmother, were arrested after years of evading authorities. The tide began to turn. But victory came slowly and at a heavy price. Entire communities had been traumatized. Corruption had gutted public trust. Neighborhoods once peaceful were scarred by the echoes of gunfire. And Miami's reputation, cemented in movies like Scarface and national news stories, became synonymous with crime, corruption, and excess. Yet even as the cocaine era faded, it left behind something strange. A myth. Outsiders looked at Miami as a place where fortunes were made overnight, where danger mixed with opportunity, where rules were flexible and ambition had no ceiling. That mythology would influence everything that came after. From the nightlife of the 1990s, to the real estate booms of the 2000s, to the tech and crypto waves of today, cocaine shaped Miami's identity in complicated ways. It fueled buildings, business empires, cultural scenes, and political networks. It also destroyed families, corrupted institutions, and brought violence beyond measure. Miami learned that its location and openness, its greatest strengths, could also become vulnerabilities. As the 1980s ended, Miami faced another turning point. The drug wars were cooling, but the city was not yet stable. Immigration waves continued. Haitian refugees arrived on overcrowded boats. Latin American political crises sent more migrants. Tourism rebounded. Downtown development resumed. And Miami, once again, began reinventing itself. But beneath the surface, the city's foundations were shifting. The Cold War was ending. The cartels were changing. Global finance was expanding. And a new chapter, one defined not by cocaine cowboys, but by globalization, cultural fusion, and Miami's emergence as an international metropolis, was beginning. The wild frontier of the 1980s had forced Miami to confront its vulnerabilities. The next era would force it to define its strengths. Chapter 11. Immigration Waves. When the dust of the cocaine era began to settle and Miami emerged from the neon-lit chaos of the 1980s, the city stood at another crossroads. The worst years of cartel violence were receding, but their aftershocks still shook Miami's reputation. The Cuban exile community remained politically dominant. Liberty City continued to fight for justice. Downtown struggled to reinvent itself. And yet, underneath the lingering turbulence, a quiet transformation was unfolding. One that would reshape Miami more profoundly than any hurricane, riot, or drug wars ever could. That transformation came not from a single place, but from everywhere at once. Throughout the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s, wave after wave of immigrants arrived in Miami, each group bringing its own story of hardship, resilience, culture, and ambition. They came fleeing dictatorships, poverty, war, corruption, and economic collapse. They came seeking safety, opportunity, or simply a chance to breathe freely. And together, they created the modern Miami, one of the most international, multilingual, culturally complex cities in the world. Miami became a living mosaic, held together not by uniformity, but by movement. Migration was not just part of Miami's history, it became its defining feature. The story of the new Miami begins in the Caribbean, with one of the most remarkable communities the city ever embraced, the Haitians. The first significant wave of Haitian migration began in the 1960s, during the brutal dictatorship of François Papadoc Duvalier. Repression, violence, and economic instability drove thousands to flee. But the largest and most dramatic movement came later, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when overcrowded boats filled with desperate families began appearing off the South Florida coast. The images shocked the world. Men, women, and children, hungry, exhausted, sun-scorched, clung to wooden vessels battered by waves. Some were rescued offshore by the Coast Guard. Others washed up on beaches, their bodies trembling with relief and fear. The journey was deadly. Many boats never reached the coast. But the Haitians kept coming. Miami reacted with a mix of compassion, political panic, and bureaucratic resistance. The U.S. government, fearing the precedent of mass boat arrivals, often detained Haitians or attempted to deport them. Activists protested. Churches opened their doors. Community leaders fought for asylum rights. In the end, despite the hostility they faced, the Haitians carved out a home. Little Haiti emerged in the 1980s and 1990s as the emotional heart of the Haitian diaspora. Centered around Northeast 2nd Avenue and 54th Street, it became a neighborhood filled with Creole restaurants, art studios, botanicas, churches, and markets selling spices, fabrics, and homeopathic remedies. Compa music filled the streets. Murals of Toussaint Louverture and Haitian flags adorned storefronts. The neighborhood pulsed with the rhythms of a culture that refused to disappear. Haitian families worked tirelessly to build new lives, often against the odds. They faced discrimination from government agencies, suspicion from local residents, and exclusion from the political system. Yet they persevered, establishing one of Miami's most vibrant cultural enclaves. Haitian radio stations broadcast community news, festivals celebrated Vodou traditions, dance, and poetry. Haitian entrepreneurs opened businesses across the city. And with time, Haitian Americans rose into Miami's institutions: law enforcement, government, education, and the arts. While the Haitian community grew in Little Haiti, another group was building a different kind of neighborhood in the western edges of Miami, far from the beaches and high-rises: Nicaraguans. Their migration had roots in the political turmoil of the 1970s, when the Somoza dictatorship was overthrown by the Sandinista revolution. But the larger waves came in the 1980s, as Nicaragua descended into civil war between the Sandinistas and the U.S.-backed Contras. Bombings, kidnappings, rationing, corruption, and fear pushed tens of thousands to flee. Many had family ties in Miami. Others simply knew that the city was one of the few places in America where Spanish was spoken everywhere, and where they might rebuild without starting from zero. Sweetwater, once a quiet suburb near Florida International University, became the heart of the Nicaraguan community. It was dubbed Little Managua, a name that still carries cultural weight today. Modest homes with tidy yards filled with citrus trees were purchased by families who had escaped political violence and economic collapse. Nicaraguan bakeries sold quesillo and nacatamales. Small restaurants served vigorón and gallo pinto. Spanish with a distinctive Nica cadence filled shopping plazas. Sweetwater grew into a hub of political activism as well. Exiles debated the situation back home, monitored elections, organized protests, and built networks of support for relatives still living under instability. Many Nicaraguans arrived with professional backgrounds: lawyers, doctors, business owners, but had to rebuild from scratch. Others took jobs in construction, hospitality, or small retail. Slowly, they climbed the ladder, sending their children to universities, buying homes, starting businesses, and shaping Miami's cultural and political landscape. While Nicaraguans made Sweetwater their home, another Latin American community was rising in Miami, a group whose arrival would transform the city's economy, real estate, and culture in unexpectedly powerful ways: the Colombians. At first, their arrival in the 1970s and 1980s was overshadowed by the violence of the cartel era. The tragedy is that the vast majority of Colombian immigrants had nothing to do with drugs. They were fleeing the very terror that made Miami infamous. Colombia was racked by guerrilla warfare, paramilitary violence, rural displacement, political turmoil, and economic instability. Ordinary families, terrified of kidnappings, assassinations, and bombings, fled to South Florida in search of peace. They settled in neighborhoods like Flagamay, Kendall, and Westchester. But it was Doral, then a sparsely developed area near the airport, that eventually became the center of Colombian life in Miami. What began as a small pocket grew into one of the most influential immigrant enclaves in the city. By the 1990s, Doral was sometimes jokingly called Doralzuela, not because of Venezuelans, that would come later, but because of the massive Colombian presence. Colombians brought an entrepreneurial spirit that infused Miami's business landscape with energy. They opened boutiques, freight forwarding companies, insurance firms, accounting offices, and restaurants. They transformed Miami's food culture with arepas, bandeja paisa, empanadas, buñuelos, and rich Colombian coffee. They invested heavily in real estate, helping fuel development in western Miami-Dade County. Their music, vallenato, salsa colombiana, later reggaeton, poured from car radios and nightclubs. Their sports enthusiasm, especially for soccer, reshaped Miami's sports bars and public viewing events. And as their numbers grew, so did their political influence. Colombian-owned companies became major players in logistics, import-export, and aviation. Industries tied deeply to Miami's identity as a hemispheric crossroads. But then, in the 2000s, and especially the 2010s, a new wave arrived. One that would add another layer of complexity to Miami's cultural mosaic. The Venezuelans. Venezuela had once been one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America, buoyed by oil riches and a thriving middle class. But political upheaval, economic mismanagement, hyperinflation, authoritarianism, and violent crackdowns shattered the country's stability. Beginning in the early 2000s and accelerating rapidly after 2014, Venezuelans fled the country in one of the largest mass migrations in modern Latin American history. They arrived in Miami with suitcases full of Bolivar bills rendered worthless by inflation, stories of empty supermarkets, and memories of a homeland descending into chaos. Many were professionals, engineers, architects, accountants, business owners. Others were young families desperate to escape an economy where paychecks lost value overnight. They settled heavily in Doral, joining the Colombian community and turning the area into a thriving pan-Latin enclave. Doral's shopping centers filled with Venezuelan bakeries selling cachitos and tequeños, areparas serving reina pepillada and domino arepas, coffee shops with papelón con limón, and restaurants featuring halacas, asado negro, and pabellón criollo. Spanish with the soft Venezuelan seseo-filled grocery stores. Venezuelan boutiques, salons, logistics companies, real estate offices, and private schools flourished. Politically, the Venezuelans became vocal, active, and determined. Rallies filled the streets after elections back home. Venezuelan flags waved at protests in downtown Miami. The community formed powerful networks advocating for humanitarian aid, immigration reform, and global pressure on the regime in Caracas. Their arrival reinforced Miami's identity as a city where exile, activism, and political memory shaped daily life. By the 2000s, Miami was unrecognizable compared to the city of the 1950s. More than half of its residents were foreign-born, the highest percentage of any major metropolitan area in the United States. Spanish was spoken more widely than English. Newspapers ran multilingual editions. Banks, hospitals, and government offices hired bilingual staff as a necessity, not an option. The airport became one of the busiest international gateways in the world. The food changed. The music changed. The politics changed. Miami became a place where Caribbean rhythms mixed with Andean traditions, where Haitian Rara festivals blended with Colombian carnivals, where Cuban cafes stood beside Nicaraguan fritangas and Venezuelan bakeries. The city's soundtrack became a fusion of salsa, merengue, compa, vallenato, hip-hop, jazz, and reggaeton. This cultural blending did not happen without tension. Waves of newcomers competed for housing, jobs, and political influence. Different exile communities carried different traumas and different visions for their new home. Language barriers, economic disparities, and cultural misunderstandings surfaced and persisted. Yet Miami remained, at its core, a city shaped not by one identity, but by the constant arrival of new ones. Immigration did not erase Miami's earlier struggles. Racial inequality, economic divides, and political friction continued. But it created an energy, a dynamism, a forward momentum that defined the city's essence. Miami became a place in perpetual motion, not just reinventing itself every decade, but every year, every month, sometimes every week. By the dawn of the 21st century, the old idea of Miami as a retirement haven, a tourist escape, or even a drug war battlefield felt obsolete. The new Miami was a global city, a Caribbean, Latin American, African American mosaic that existed nowhere else in the world. And as the 2010s progressed, Miami's story was still far from finished. New challenges, climate change, rising seas, soaring housing prices, tech booms, political shifts, and global investment were arriving with the same force as the migration waves that had shaped the city for a century. The next chapter of Miami's history would test the city's ability to adapt yet again and reveal whether the Magic City's magic could survive a future unlike anything it had faced before. Chapter 12: Art Deco, the Beach, and Global Pop Culture. By the time Miami entered the late 20th century, the city had already experienced more rebirths than most places see in a century. Waves of immigrants had reshaped its neighborhoods. The cocaine era had scorched it with both infamy and wealth. The Cuban Revolution had remade its politics, and Haitian, Nicaraguan, Colombian, and Venezuelan communities infused it with an international heartbeat. Yet, as powerful as these forces were, they only told part of Miami's story. Because there was another Miami, one that came to symbolize glamour, escapism, style, and fantasy. A Miami that would dominate postcards, magazine covers, fashion spreads, music videos, and Hollywood films. A Miami instantly recognizable from a single palm tree silhouette against pastel skies. And that Miami was born on the beach, not the modern beach with polished luxury high-rises and billionaire condos. But Miami Beach, its Art Deco district, its neon glow, its resurrected architecture, its wild nightlife, its fashion world ascendance, and the irresistible image that turned it into one of the most iconic destinations on Earth. To understand how Miami Beach became a global symbol, you have to go back to the beginning, to a time before it was glamorous at all. In the early 20th century, Miami Beach was little more than a mangrove sandbar separated from the mainland by Biscayne Bay. Developers like Carl Fisher dredged, filled, and reshaped it into a playground for the wealthy. But even Fisher could not have imagined what the beach would become after its darkest moment. The devastation of the 1926 hurricane had nearly wiped Miami Beach off the map. Hotels were flattened, streets were buried in sand. The dream seemed broken. Yet, in the ashes of that destruction, a new architectural movement was waiting, one that would define the city's identity for generations. Art Deco. When the 1930s arrived, economic hardship defined the nation. Miami, still recovering from natural disasters and financial collapse, looked for a way to entice visitors back. Architects and developers found their answer in the emerging Art Deco style. A bold, geometric, optimistic design language born in Europe and popularized in world fairs and industrial design. Miami embraced it like no other city. Pastel-colored hotels rose along Ocean Drive. Their curves, ziggurats, porthole windows, and racing stripes echoed both the ocean and the machine age. The Colony Hotel, the Essex House, the Carlisle, the Breakwater, the Majestic. Each building contributed to a visual symphony of color and shape. Neon lights outlined facades. Chrome accents gleamed in the sun. At night, the buildings glowed like luminous jewels along the coastline. Miami Beach became a showcase for Art Deco that existed nowhere else on the planet. But beauty alone wasn't enough to secure its survival. After World War II, Miami Beach thrived as a retirement haven and winter tourist escape. But by the 1970s, the neighborhood declined dramatically. Many Art Deco hotels were aging, neglected, or targeted for demolition. Developers saw profit in replacing them with modern towers. The architectural gems that had once dazzled the world were crumbling. The future of Miami Beach hung in the balance. Enter the preservationists, activists, historians, artists, and architects who understood that the Art Deco district was unlike anything else. One of the most influential figures was Barbara Bear Capitman, who founded the Miami Design Preservation League. She and her supporters staged protests, petitioned the city, and fought developers in court. They faced harassment, threats, and public criticism. Some developers derided the old buildings as outdated relics. But Capitman and her allies persisted. Their victory came in 1979, when Miami Beach's Art Deco district was officially listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the first 20th century historic district to receive such recognition. That designation saved the buildings and set the stage for one of the most extraordinary urban revivals in American history. The preservation movement transformed Miami Beach from a forgotten strip of decaying hotels into a global cultural treasure. Investors poured in. Restoration projects blossomed. Artists and photographers rediscovered the district. Designers saw its potential for fashion shoots. Film crews arrived. A new kind of Miami Beach began to emerge: hip, stylish, edgy, nostalgic, and futuristic all at once. This rebirth coincided with a shift in global pop culture. Television expanded, music videos exploded in influence. Fashion magazines sought exotic backdrops. Hollywood embraced stylized aesthetics. Miami Beach, with its pastel shades, neon glow, and sun-soaked decadence, became irresistible. Then came the lightning strike: Miami Vice. The television series, debuting in 1984, altered the world's perception of Miami forever. Its neon palette, pastel suits, fast boats, and thumping synth soundtrack presented Miami as a place where beauty and danger collided in equal measure. The show used Miami Beach like a character. Its Art Deco hotels, glowing nightlife, and ocean vistas serving as the perfect stage for stories of vice, glamour, and intrigue. Millions of viewers around the world watched Miami Vice and fell in love with the city's aesthetic. Tourists arrived hoping to step into that world. Photographers, fashion designers, and musicians followed. The Art Deco skyline became iconic, synonymous with cool. But perhaps the most defining moment of Miami Beach's new era came in the 1990s, in the form of one man whose name was already known across continents: Gianni Versace. In 1992, the Italian fashion designer purchased a mansion on Ocean Drive. Casa Casuarina, an opulent Mediterranean-style villa that would become the heart of his creative empire. Versace didn't just move to Miami Beach. He embraced it, shaped it, elevated it. His presence legitimized the city as a global fashion capital. Supermodels, photographers, artists, and celebrities flocked to his mansion. Parties became legendary. Fashion houses took notice. South Beach became a magnet for the world's elite. Versace's style was flamboyant, bold, luxurious, and perfectly aligned with Miami Beach's aesthetic revival. When he walked Ocean Drive in his linen shirts, he embodied the city's blend of glamour and casual decadence. In the fashion world, his Miami years became legendary, cementing the city's reputation as a place where style, sexuality, beauty, and edge converged. His tragic death in 1997, shot on his own doorstep, shocked the world and cast a somber shadow over Miami Beach's shining image. But even in tragedy, the symbolism of his presence endured. Versace had shown the world what Miami Beach could be: a global icon of culture, fashion, and artistic reinvention. But the beach's ascent didn't stop with high fashion. The 1990s also brought a cultural phenomenon that turned Miami Beach into a rite of passage for an entire generation. MTV Spring Break. Every year, thousands of college students descended on the beach to dance, drink, party, and escape winter. MTV broadcast the scenes: sun-drenched crowds, DJs spinning on open-air stages, celebrities hosting wild competitions. Miami Beach became the epicenter of youth culture in America. For millions of viewers, the city became synonymous with freedom, escape, music, and heat. Ocean Drive, once neglected, became a global landmark. Restaurants spilled onto sidewalks. Nightclubs pulsed until sunrise. DJs from Europe and Latin America brought electronic music to the city. Models posed along the beach at sunrise. The Strip became a living postcard, every angle photogenic, every night electric, every day shimmering with possibility. Yet beneath the glamour, something deeper was happening. Miami Beach was becoming not just a fashion hub or party destination, but a symbol of international culture. The Art Deco district, once saved by activists, became the foundation for Miami's new identity. A city where the past and future coexisted in brilliant color. Architecture students came to study its forms. Photographers traveled from Asia and Europe to capture its angles. Filmmakers used it as a backdrop. Musicians referenced it in lyrics. Celebrities bought condos and restored hotels. And tourists, millions of them, arrived each year from around the world. Miami Beach became a global brand. And like all of Miami's transformations, it didn't happen in isolation. The rebirth of the beach intertwined with the immigration waves that shaped the mainland. Haitian artists brought their craft to Wynwood. Colombian entrepreneurs invested in hotels and restaurants. Cuban families ran cafes and boutiques. Venezuelan designers joined fashion circles. Bahamian and Jamaican musicians influenced the soundscape. Miami's cultural explosion was not manufactured in studios or marketing agencies. It was organic, chaotic, and deeply international. Art Deco preservation had saved the city's architectural soul, but immigration had given it a global voice. By the 2000s, Miami Beach was part of a larger cultural renaissance sweeping through the county. South Beach grew more upscale. The Lincoln Road Mall revived as a pedestrian oasis. International Art Basel chose Miami Beach as its American home, instantly positioning the city as a global center for contemporary art. Wynwood's warehouses transformed into murals and galleries. Music festivals filled the city's parks. Fashion shows returned to the beach with new vigor. Miami no longer needed to imitate other cities. It had its own language, visual, musical, cultural, and the world was listening. Yet even in its glamour, Miami Beach remained fragile. Rising seas lapped against its shores. Storm surges threatened its foundations. Preservation battles continued. Tourism fluctuated. But the resilience that defined every chapter of Miami's history persisted. The beach continued to glow, evolve, and reinvent itself. By the 2000s, Miami had become a global pop culture powerhouse. From Pitbull's anthems to J Balvin's videos, from blockbuster movies to international fashion campaigns, from Art Basel installations to Instagram's pastel-hued tourism fantasies, Miami's image saturated the world. And as the city moved deeper into the new millennium, a new question emerged. What happens when a city built on reinvention faces challenges it cannot simply outgrow or outshine? The next chapter of Miami's story would take aim at that question. Climate change, rising seas, tech-driven transformation, housing battles, and the future identity of a city still rewriting its destiny one wave at a time. Chapter 13. Hurricanes, Climate, and the Fight Against the Sea. Miami has always been a place defined by reinvention, migration, glamour, and ambition. But beneath every chapter, beneath the Art Deco facades, the neon glow of Ocean Drive, the political struggles, the cultural explosions, one truth has remained constant. Miami is a city living on borrowed land, and the ocean has never forgotten that. From the moment the first settlers arrived along the Miami River, the sea has shaped everything. The coconut groves on the beach, the trade routes across the Caribbean, the hurricanes that flatten entire neighborhoods, and the rising tides that creep silently into streets once safe and dry. Miami's constant battle with nature is not a subplot. It is the story behind all the others. A story about fragility, risk, engineering, hope, and the stubborn human desire to build paradise on the edge of a shifting world. Long before the word climate became a global obsession, Miami had already learned the hard way what the sea was capable of. The hurricane of 1926 remains etched in the city's bones. In Chapter 6, it appeared as the disaster that ended the roaring land boom. But to the people who lived through it, it was something far more visceral. Winds over 140 miles per hour tore through Miami like a monster made of air. Storm surge swallowed homes. Downtown windows shattered beneath flying debris. Entire neighborhoods vanished in the roar. For years afterward, survivors told stories of roofs flying off like paper, of boats landing blocks inland, of the eerie calm when the eye passed over the city, followed by a second wave of destruction on the backside of the storm. It was a warning. But Miami, even then, was a place that refused to surrender. The city rebuilt, tourists returned. Developers built bigger, stronger, and closer to the water. By the 1950s, Miami had once again become a symbol of tropical optimism. But storms never stopped coming. Hurricane Donna in 1960, Betsy in 1965, Cleo in 1964. Each storm left scars, flattened homes, flooded streets, power lines strewn across lawns like tangled wire webs. Residents patched roofs and swept debris from driveways. Insurance rates climbed, but the city continued to grow. Still, nothing prepared Miami for what happened in August 1992. Hurricane Andrew was small in diameter, but catastrophic in force. One of the strongest storms ever to strike the United States. When Andrew made landfall in South Dade, it was a Category 5, a level of destruction Miami had never experienced in its modern history. Winds reached 165 miles per hour. Entire neighborhoods in Homestead and Florida City were shredded beyond recognition. Concrete walls cracked like eggshells. Airplanes were tossed around at Homestead Air Force Base. Mobile homes disintegrated. Trees lost every leaf, every branch. Cars flipped like toys. The morning after Andrew passed, the destruction was biblical. Electric poles snapped. Streets were impassable beneath mountains of debris. More than 160,000 people were left homeless. Families searched for missing pets, missing photographs, missing pieces of their lives. Looting broke out. Relief supplies struggled to reach the hardest-hit areas. Some communities lacked power for weeks. Andrew was not just a storm, it was a reckoning. The devastation forced Miami and the entire state of Florida to rethink everything: building codes, insurance systems, emergency planning, even the way weather forecasts were communicated. The city realized that its future depended not only on real estate speculation or tourism, but on resilience, on engineering capable of withstanding the unthinkable. After Andrew, homes had to be strapped tighter to foundations. Windows had to be impact-resistant. Roofs required stronger fastenings. Construction crews learned new methods. Inspectors demanded higher standards. Miami became, paradoxically, one of the most hurricane-prepared cities in the world. Not because it wanted to be, but because it had to be. But storms were only half the battle. There was another, quieter threat rising in the background, one not defined by fast-moving winds, but by slow-moving water. By the early 2000s, scientists began sounding alarms with increasing urgency. Miami was among the most vulnerable cities on the planet to sea level rise. Unlike most coastal cities, Miami sits on porous limestone, a geological sponge. Even if you build a seawall, the water can seep underneath it, bubbling up through storm drains and basements. Traditional engineering tools simply don't work the same way here. And the sea was rising, slowly at first, an inch here, a fraction there. But with every passing year, king tides pushed farther inland. Streets in Miami Beach began flooding on sunny days, salt water bubbling up through manhole covers like a ghost of the ocean. People joked about sunny day floods, but the humor masked a growing anxiety. Parking garages filled with brackish water. Businesses along Alton Road placed sandbags outside their doors. Residents set alarms, not just for rainstorms, but for tides. Miami Beach responded with one of the most ambitious urban resilience projects in American history. Engineers installed giant pump stations capable of shifting millions of gallons of water. Roads were raised by several feet, turning sidewalks into trenches and garages into quasi-basements. A city essentially built on sand was lifted back into the air, one street at a time. It was a bold solution, but one that came with complications. Raised streets meant altered drainage patterns. Some homeowners complained their living rooms were now lower than the public road. Others welcomed the change, but feared it was a temporary fix for a long-term problem. Meanwhile, on the mainland, neighborhoods like Brickell and Edgewater found themselves increasingly vulnerable. Luxury towers stood tall, but their parking decks flooded. Storm surge maps expanded. Developers responded with creative solutions: elevated foundations, waterproof lobbies, emergency generators placed far above ground level. Miami real estate marketing pivoted from oceanfront beauty to hurricane-rated glass, elevated living, and storm-resilient construction. Yet, even with all these innovations, the fundamental reality remained. The sea was rising, and Miami was still a city built on porous rock. Hurricanes, storm surge, and sea level rise converged into a new era of uncertainty. The very geography that had made Miami a gateway to the Americas, the warm waters, flat land, tropical climate, became the source of existential danger. But if Miami has shown anything over its century of reinvention, it is that the city refuses to give up. Political battles erupted at every level. Local leaders sought funding for resilience infrastructure. State politicians debated climate policy. Federal agencies issued new flood maps. Environmentalists warned of disappearing wetlands and dying coral reefs. Real estate developers fought to maintain property values. Insurance companies raised premiums to painful levels or withdrew entirely. Some residents spoke of climate gentrification, the idea that higher ground inland, traditionally home to working-class communities, was becoming coveted as coastal neighborhoods grew riskier. The fight against the sea became not just an engineering challenge, but a social and political one. Yet, alongside the fear and anxiety, there was innovation. Miami became a laboratory for climate adaptation. Architects designed amphibious homes, scientists studied coral restoration and mangrove shoreline defenses. Urban planners experimented with green infrastructure. Parks that could flood safely, elevated walkways, permeable pavement, and canals designed to absorb stormwater. Miami's universities turned into research hubs. Conferences on resilience drew experts from around the world. The city's tech boom, concentrated in neighborhoods like Wynwood and Brickell, began attracting entrepreneurs focused on climate solutions. Investors saw opportunity in the challenge. Still, the storms kept coming. Hurricane Wilma in 2005 left downtown windows shattered and power knocked out. Irma in 2017 pushed water into Brickell and the Keys, leaving debris scattered across the county. Each storm served as a reminder. Miami lived on the front line. And yet, people kept arriving. They came for opportunity, for sun, for culture, for reinvention, for the sense that Miami, for all its risks, was alive in a way few cities were. Even as the seas crept up, skyscrapers kept rising. The skyline grew denser, taller, glossier. Miami was fighting the ocean, but it was also doubling down on its identity. Climate challenges did not diminish Miami's ambition, they sharpened it. By the 2020s, Miami's story had become a paradox. A city threatened by water, yet embraced by millions. A city aware of its vulnerabilities, yet determined to thrive. A place where engineering, politics, culture, and nature collided daily. Hurricanes shaped Miami's past. Climate change shapes its future. And the fight against the sea defines its present, street by street, pump by pump, vote by vote, storm by storm. What emerges from that fight is something only Miami could produce. Resilience woven with optimism, struggle fused with glamour, science infused with the stubborn belief that the city's magic is stronger than its dangers. Miami may be built on limestone, but it is also built on hope. And hope, in Miami, is not passive. It is a force as powerful as the tides themselves. Chapter 14. Tech Hub, Crypto Boom, and the Miami of Tomorrow. For more than a century, Miami has lived many lives. It has been a Tequesta homeland, a Spanish frontier, a British outpost, a Seminole battleground, a railroad miracle, a boomtown, a wartime gateway, a Cuban exile capital, a battleground for civil rights, a city synonymous with glamour, a cautionary tale of drugs and corruption, an immigrant mosaic, an Art Deco legend, and a place forever wrestling with the ocean's power. Each chapter left its scars and its gifts. Each chapter transformed the city in ways no one could have predicted. And now, in the early decades of the 21st century, Miami has stepped into yet another identity, one that few imagined even 20 years ago. The birthplace of the Orange Blossom Special, the playground of Sinatra, the haven of exiles, the neon paradise of nightlife. Miami became something new, a global tech hub, a crypto capital, a magnet for billionaires, a city where the next version of America is being imagined in real time. The Miami of today is a crossroads of engineering, ambition, speculation, art, and heat. Cultural heat, financial heat, and the literal heat of a warming world. The city is becoming, once again, a laboratory for the future. The transformation began quietly, almost invisibly. In the early 2000s, Miami's economy was still recovering from the Great Recession, its real estate market battered by foreclosures, its tourism sector struggling. The city had long been known as a gateway to Latin America, but few saw it as a center of high-tech innovation. Silicon Valley, Boston, and New York dominated America's tech imagination. Miami, humid, flashy, and sometimes chaotic, seemed worlds away from the clean lines and button-down culture of the Northern Tech Corridor. But change was brewing. Miami had something no tech city could replicate. Proximity to Latin America, a multilingual workforce, a booming immigrant class hungry for opportunity, and, perhaps most importantly, affordability compared to New York and San Francisco. People with ambitions but without trust funds began looking for a place where they could build something without drowning in rent. Wynwood was the first hint of what was coming. What had once been a warehouse district dotted with factories and abandoned buildings began to attract street artists in the early 2000s. Graffiti, once erased or ignored, now took over entire blocks. Murals exploded with color and symbolism, portraits, dreamscapes, political messages, geometric kaleidoscopes. The Wynwood walls became a pilgrimage site for artists from around the world. Restaurants and boutiques followed. Galleries opened in renovated garages. Tech meetups started appearing in repurposed factories. The neighborhood grew into a kind of cultural petri dish, a place where the boundaries between art, business, nightlife, and technology blurred. By the mid-2000s, Miami's slow shift toward the digital economy was beginning to show. Startups launched in Brickell co-working spaces. Latin American entrepreneurs, facing instability in their home countries, created businesses with Miami as their safe harbor. Venture capital firms began scouting the city. Yet the change was still subtle, a whisper compared to what would come next. Then came 2020. The pandemic reshaped the geography of America's workforce. Offices shut down. Remote work became the norm. People fled expensive, locked-down cities in search of space, warmth, and freedom. Florida remained open for business. Miami became a magnet almost overnight. A single tweet from the mayor, "How can I help?" went viral among tech leaders. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a signal that Miami welcomed innovation with open arms. And the flood began. Tech founders arrived from San Francisco, fleeing high taxes, restrictive policies, and astronomical home prices. Finance executives came from New York, bringing their funds, their networks, and their capital. Hedge funds, private equity firms, crypto companies, and venture capitalists opened satellite offices or moved entirely. Suddenly, Miami was no longer simply a gateway to Latin America. It was a gateway to the future. With money came speed. Luxury towers rose fast. Sleek skyscrapers in Brickell, waterfront developments in Edgewater, mansions in Coconut Grove and Miami Beach restored or newly built. Housing prices skyrocketed. Miami became one of the least affordable cities in the nation, even as its population surged. For some residents, the transformation felt like opportunity. For others, it felt like displacement. The city, once again, found itself balancing reinvention with inequality. The crypto boom hit Miami like a lightning bolt. Blockchain evangelists, Bitcoin maximalists, altcoin founders, and NFT creators saw Miami as the perfect backdrop. Futuristic, flashy, global, young. Crypto conferences filled downtown hotels. Digital art shows took over Wynwood warehouses. Miami embraced the identity with the enthusiasm of a place that had always reinvented itself, proposing city-backed cryptocurrencies, allowing Bitcoin payments for certain transactions, and marketing itself as the crypto capital of the world. At its height, the boom felt unstoppable. Money poured into blockchain startups. Cryptocurrency ATMs dotted convenience stores. Tech companies hosted parties on yachts. Influencers filmed videos atop rooftop pools. But like all speculative waves in Miami's history, from the 1920s land boom to the cocaine economy of the 1980s, the rise of crypto carried volatility. When the global crypto market crashed in 2022, Miami felt the shock. Some companies folded, others downsized. The swagger softened. But the underlying shift, the permanent relocation of tech talent, investors, and financial institutions, remained. Miami's transformation wasn't a fad. It was structural. Even as crypto cooled, technology and finance continued to anchor themselves in the city. Miami became a new kind of financial bridge, one connecting the U.S. not only with Latin America, but with global capital flows from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Wealthy investors purchased second homes, then third homes. Foreign buyers treated Miami as both an investment and an insurance policy against political instability back home. Brickell Avenue, once a cluster of banks, evolved into a high-density canyon of luxury towers filled with lawyers, traders, entrepreneurs, and families from half a dozen continents. The skyline, already striking, became even more dramatic. Developers competed to hire star architects, Zaha Hadid, Cesar Pelli, Arquitectonica, to leave their mark on the city. Buildings twisted, curved, shimmered. Brickell's city center added an airy canopy that filtered sunlight like the wings of a butterfly. Edgewater, once ignored, sprouted towers that hugged Biscayne Bay. Midtown filled in with parks, cafes, and residences. Wynwood's murals were now the backdrop for tech startups and venture capital offices. The influx of money created a paradox that has come to define modern Miami. A city of immense opportunity and staggering inequality. Luxury cars lined the streets, while working-class families struggled with rising rents. Construction cranes dotted the skyline. But some neighborhoods saw displacement and cultural erosion. Yet, even amid these tensions, Miami pulsed with energy, ambition, and a sense that something globally significant was taking shape. What made Miami so magnetic in this era was not simply its beaches, weather, or tax advantages. It was the feeling that Miami was the future of America. Multilingual, multicultural, decentralized, entrepreneurial, borderless. A city not defined by old institutions, but shaped by new ideas. A city where immigrants could build companies as easily as they built families. A city where English mixed with Spanish, Creole, Portuguese, Russian, and French on any given afternoon. A city where people from Caracas, Bogota, San Juan, and Buenos Aires could instantly find familiarity. A city where startups spoke directly to global markets rather than only to American ones. This is why, even as the crypto craze faded, the tech ecosystem continued to expand. Artificial intelligence labs opened, fintech firms relocated, Latin American founders created billion-dollar companies from Miami apartments. Venture capital flowed in from Silicon Valley firms, eager to diversify. Miami became a testing ground for smart city ideas. Autonomous shuttles, electric mobility networks, resilient infrastructure, and climate tech incubators. But perhaps the most defining symbol of Miami's new identity was Wynwood's evolution. What began as a mural district became a full-fledged innovation zone. Part art gallery, part nightlife destination, part startup campus. Street art layered itself over old concrete. Breweries and coffee shops sat next to crypto exchanges. Sound stages for content creators coexisted with experimental fashion studios. Wynwood became the physical expression of Miami's newest reinvention. Colorful, chaotic, global, youthful, and unapologetically ambitious. At the same time, Miami's role as a cultural powerhouse grew. Design Miami became one of the world's premier art events. Art Basel Miami Beach elevated the city's reputation among collectors and celebrities. Ultra Music Festival brought electronic music fans from every continent. Latin Grammy winners recorded albums here. International sports stars trained here. Fashion shoots, film productions, and influencer empires found Miami's light irresistible. Miami was no longer just a backdrop for stories. It was the setting where new global culture was being created. Luxury followed. High-end restaurants opened faster than reservations could be booked. Brands like Balenciaga, Dior, and Louis Vuitton established flagship stores. Billionaire Island, Fisher Island, became a symbol of ultimate exclusivity. Star athletes and celebrities purchased waterfront mansions. Boats the size of buildings filled marinas. The Port of Miami became one of the most important cruise and shipping hubs in the world, an engine of tourism and trade. The airport expanded into a sprawling global gateway. Yet despite the glamour, the tech expansion, and the surging real estate values, the question of Miami's tomorrow remains both exciting and uncertain. The oceans still rise. Hurricanes still form over warm Caribbean waters. The cost of living still climbs relentlessly. Infrastructure strains beneath rapid growth. The city's identity constantly shifts under pressure from global forces, economic, environmental, social. But if Miami has proven anything, it is that reinvention is not a phase. It is the city's defining trait. The Miami of tomorrow will not be static. It will be shaped by the same forces that molded the city's past. Risk, ambition, migration, opportunity, and the brutal beauty of the natural world. The tech sector will continue to evolve. Some startups will fail, others will thrive, and new ones will rise from unlikely places. Crypto may surge again or fade into niche use. But the entrepreneurs drawn here by its promise will leave their mark regardless. Immigration will continue to reshape neighborhoods. Music, art, and nightlife will reinvent themselves with each generation. The city's battle with climate change will intensify, forcing new engineering breakthroughs and political choices. Miami may become the global capital of climate adaptation, or it may struggle under the weight of its vulnerabilities. But whatever direction it takes, the city will face the challenge with its characteristic mixture of danger, optimism, and audacity. For now, Miami stands at a crossroads, humming with energy. Construction cranes dot the skyline. Investors walk through Wynwood with iced coffees in hand. Founders pitch multi-million-dollar ideas over lunch and brickle. Artists paint new murals each morning. Families walk the beach at sunset. And all around, the city's future takes shape. Fast, unpredictable, and dazzling. Miami is no longer just a beach city, or a retirement escape, or a hub for exiles, or a party capital. It is a global city, a place where the world meets, where cultures collide, where fortunes rise and collapse and rise again, where hurricanes roar, where artists dream, where innovators build, and where the future arrives early. The Miami of tomorrow is already here, and, as always, it refuses to be anything less than extraordinary. Chapter 15. Miami Today. The Miami of the present is a city that feels alive in a way few places on Earth do. Electric, unpredictable, multilingual, chaotic, luxurious, gritty, ambitious, fragile, and absolutely unforgettable. It is a place where contradictions do not merely coexist, they dance with each other, collide with each other, and somehow create something that feels impossibly vibrant. To understand Miami today is to understand a city that has been reborn more times than most civilizations, and that still, after everything, refuses to be defined by any single identity. Miami today is the product of every chapter that came before. It carries the memory of the Tequesta, who once fished the waters of the river. It carries traces of Spanish missions that never quite took. It carries the whispered stories of Bahamian wreckers, Seminole warriors, and enslaved people who fled into the swamps seeking freedom. It carries the imprint of Julia Tuttle's orange blossoms, the scars of hurricanes that left streets underwater, the shadows of cocaine-era shootouts, the resilience of Liberty City, the power of Cuban exile politics, the creativity of Little Haiti, the music pulsing out of Calle Ocho, the ambitions of tech pioneers, the murals of Wynwood, the billionaires of Brickell, and the constant, unstoppable pressure of the rising sea. Everything touches everything else, and the result is a city unlike any other. If you walk down Collins Avenue on a humid night, you can feel the layers. Neon signs glow on buildings that were saved from demolition decades ago, their pastel Art Deco geometry looking as modern as the day they were built. Brass chandeliers swing over hotel lobbies where tourists speak English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Creole in a single breath. Music thumps from rooftop bars, electronic beats blending with salsa rhythms drifting up from the street. A waitress from Honduras carries plates of sushi to a table of New Yorkers, while a family from Brazil takes photos of the lifeguard tower under a cotton candy-colored sunset. This is Miami, a crossroads where the Caribbean and Latin America meet the United States, where old identities dissolve and new ones emerge. Miami's diversity is not a statistic. It is a living force that shapes every conversation, every business deal, every neighborhood. There is no single dominant culture here, only layers of cultures, each with its own history, its own stories of exile and opportunity, its own flavors, its own heartache, its own triumphs. A map of Miami is not simply a geographic layout. It is a mosaic of diasporas. Little Havana, Little Haiti, Doralzuela, Sweetwater, Overtown, Hialeah, Kendall, Coconut Grove, Miami Gardens. Each neighborhood carries a unique rhythm. Walk through Little Havana, and the scent of Cuban coffee hits you before the sound of dominoes does. Walk through Little Haiti, and you'll hear compa music spilling out of corner shops. Walk through Doral, and you'll hear Spanish spoken with Colombian, Venezuelan, and Argentinian accents, each distinct, each unmistakable. And walk through Brickell today, just a few miles away, and you'll hear languages from 5 continents, spoken by founders, bankers, and investors in designer suits and sneakers, weaving their lives into the glass-walled towers that now define the skyline. Miami is chaos, but it is organized chaos. It should not work, and yet it does. The wealth gap is visible everywhere. Supercars glide past buses full of workers heading home from shifts at hotels and restaurants. Condos sell for millions on one block, while, on the next, families struggle with rising rents and long commutes. Construction cranes decorate the horizon, but longtime residents fear displacement. The city's opulence and its hardships sit side by side, uncomfortably close, as if reminding each other that the magic comes with a price. And yet, the energy never fades. Miami's nightlife is legendary, and not just because of the clubs. The city has a nocturnal heartbeat. It hums after sunset, the heat lingering on the sidewalks, the air thick with possibility. People gather on terraces with mojitos and laughter. Music spills from jazz bars, reggaeton blares from passing cars, electronic beats shake festival tents on the beach. After midnight, the entire city feels like a threshold, something between a dream and a performance. Tourism remains Miami's lifeblood. Years of reinvention have transformed it from a seasonal destination into a year-round global magnet. From the cruise port, the busiest in the world, millions board ships with itineraries stretching across the Caribbean. The airport, constantly expanding, handles flights from Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. Hotels rise and fall with each cycle of growth. Conventions bring tech entrepreneurs, fashion experts, crypto enthusiasts, or art collectors during the whirlwind of Art Basel. But tourism alone does not define the city. Miami's street culture, raw, expressive, imperfect, is equally powerful. Graffiti murals in Wynwood change monthly, reflecting political tensions, artistic movements, and social struggles. Skateboarders ride beneath the overpasses. Street vendors sell ropa vieja, pastelitos, ceviche, tacos, and Haitian patties from food trucks parked near office towers. Musicians play on sidewalks. Young people film TikToks in alleys that have become global backdrops. And in sports, Miami has become a stage larger than itself. The Miami Heat transformed the city with the intensity of its fan culture and the fire of its championships. The Dolphins, long-enduring heartbreak, carry the weight of Florida's football passion. The Marlins and Panthers add to the legacy. Inter Miami brought a new era with Lionel Messi, one of the greatest athletes in history, turning South Florida into a global soccer hotspot overnight. Stadiums erupt with sound, drums, chants, flags, fireworks, songs that echo through entire neighborhoods. Sports here are more than entertainment. They're identity, pride, and sometimes escape. Politics in Miami is just as fierce. The city plays an outsized role nationally, especially in debates over immigration, Cuba, Venezuela, policing, climate change, housing affordability, and the U.S. relationship with Latin America. Miami-Dade elections are often unpredictable, shaped by generational differences within immigrant groups, by language, by exile memories, by economic uncertainty, and by a distrust of institutions rooted in traumatic histories abroad. Local politics are fiery, passionate, sometimes chaotic, like the city itself. Miami's cuisine reflects its multicultural soul: ceviche flavored with Peruvian leche de tigre, Caribbean curries, Haitian griot with pickles, Cuban sandwiches dripping with mustard, arepas sold on street corners, Colombian bakeries with guava pastries, Asian Latin fusion restaurants that reinterpret old traditions in bold ways. Miami eats like a city with no borders, because culturally, it has none. But for all its magic, Miami still lives under the shadow of nature. Hurricanes remain a constant threat, and the rising sea continues to push into streets during king tide season. Residents keep plywood sheets in garages, New buildings are designed like fortresses. Weather apps are checked obsessively during storm season. People joke about preparing hurricane parties, but beneath the humor is a pragmatic understanding that life near the water means living with risk. Miami today stands at the intersection of beauty and fragility, prosperity and inequality, glamour and struggle. And that tension is what gives it its energy. The city's unpredictability is not a flaw. It is its essence. People come to Miami to reinvent themselves, to escape, to dream, to build, to flee something behind, to chase something new, to find a version of themselves that wouldn't exist in any other city in America. Every sunrise over Biscayne Bay feels like an invitation. Every thunderstorm feels like a reminder. Every new building feels like a gamble. Every immigrant story feels like a chapter added to an endless mural. Walking along the beach at dawn, you can hear the waves crash against the shore, the same rhythm the Tequesta heard thousands of years ago. But behind you rises a skyline they could never have imagined. Tall, glassy, glittering, as if the city itself is reaching upward, defying the water below. Miami's story has always been shaped by extremes of culture, climate, wealth, movement, and ambition. It is a city where fortunes are made and lost. A city where storms reshape entire neighborhoods. A city that burns bright, sometimes too bright, but never fades. A city where change is the only constant. And that is the magic. Miami today is not the final version of Miami. The city will change again and again. It may become the global capital of climate resilience. It may become a technological powerhouse. It may transform again through waves of immigration, economic shifts, political upheaval, or environmental challenges. But it will never be predictable, and it will never stand still. The Magic City earned its nickname not because of illusions or tricks, but because of its ability to transform, to reinvent, to survive, to thrive, to attract people from every corner of the world, and to make them feel, if only for a moment, that life can be larger, brighter, wilder, and more intense than anywhere else. Miami is magic. Miami is chaos. Miami is home for millions who built it, who love it, who fear it, and who believe in it. And its story, the story you've just heard across centuries, is still unfolding. Because Miami, more than any other American city, refuses to be anything less than extraordinary.